And welcome to the second meeting of 2014 of the Public Audit Committee. Can I ask members of the public and members of the committee and witnesses to make sure that electronic devices are switched off? Thank you. I have apologies from Bob Doris. We're not sure yet whether he's going to be able to attend later, but for the time being, his apologies are in. And we have apologies also from Tavish Scott, who has some constituency commitments, I think, at the moment. Item 1 on the agenda, can we agree to take items 4 and 5 in private? Thank you. Item 2, Scotland Act 2012. We heard at our last meeting from the National Audit Office and from HMRC. And this morning we have Alistair Brown, who's the Deputy Director, and Jonathan Sewell, who's the Principal Policy Analyst from the Finance Directorate of the Scottish Government. We have Caroline Gardner, the Auditor General for Scotland, Russell Frith, and who's the Assistant Auditor General, and Mark Taylor, Assistant Director of Audit Scotland. Welcome. Can I, before committee members ask any questions, can I ask any of you, having listened or read what was said at the last meeting, do you have any comments to make on what you had heard or read?
I have no specific comments, Convener. Just very happy to answer questions from the committee members.
And the same applies for us, Convener.
Okay. What would be the views of either the Scottish Government or Audit Scotland on how adequate the draft amendment that has been laid is? Is there anything that needs to be done to strengthen that, to ensure that all the relevant issues are addressed? Now, we've already heard that I think the reports or the accounts would be laid in the Scottish Parliament, so therefore this committee would have the opportunity to look at that. But do you think that the amendment addresses sufficiently the concerns or any of the worries which have been expressed?
I believe that the amendment does address the key issues. I think probably the Auditor General would have a better view of the issues than I, because I think they concern the matter of accountability and audit most closely. But it seems to me that the proposed amendment, which the UK Government intends should be in the Finance Bill for 2014, does appropriately fill out the role and responsibilities of the additional accounting officer, which we've known about for some time, the role itself, but it seems to me that the amendment fills that out in a sensible way.
Okay, thank you. Auditor General.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, our view is that the amendment, insofar as it relates to the responsibilities of the Comptroller and Auditor General in relation to the audit of HMRC's performance in collecting the Scottish rate of income tax, does what's required, with the requirement to report on the way in which the amounts collected are reported and the cost of reporting them, and the discretion to look at value for money relating to all of that cover the three most important areas to us. I think it was clear in the committee's last session that there are some other areas that will benefit from being fleshed out and agreed before the Scottish rate of income tax comes into effect in 2016, about the form of that report, about the way in which Audit Scotland works with the National Audit Office to provide assurance to you about the coverage of Scottish interests, about the ways in which you can take evidence on that, can all be dealt with in subsequent places, such as the Memorandum of Understanding, but the legislation itself provides a good basis for that in our view.
We heard at our last meeting that there were legal impediments to Audit Scotland gaining access to information on taxation and revenues. And that's understandable because there is a very clear legal framework within which both HMRC and the National Audit Office operate. I think it's fair to say that we also heard, especially from the National Audit Office, you know, a willingness to cooperate with Audit Scotland. Nevertheless, given that essentially that some of that would operate on the basis of goodwill or a memorandum of understanding, would that still give Audit Scotland sufficient capability of delving in to the accounts to ensure that there was not just transparency, but more to the point, fairness and competence in identifying and collecting the Scottish element of income tax?
I think it's worth saying in the first place that the way in which the Scottish rate of income tax is constructed, with a shared tax base administered through a UK-wide system, does throw up some challenges that we all need to work together to resolve in terms of giving this committee and the Parliament assurance about the amounts collected and the cost of them. It's clear that that HMRC is a UK-wide body, and the audit responsibility is in line with all of the other UK-wide bodies with the National Audit Office. Specifically in relation to HMRC, there are, as we would all expect, strong protections around taxpayer confidentiality, which mean that we wouldn't have access to taxpayer records there, whatever we were doing and working with NAO on the audit work that they carry out. I think the proposals that you heard about 2 weeks ago that we've been very much part of discussing, that suggest that we in Audit Scotland would have a role in discussing with the National Audit Office their planned audit work, discussing with them what the findings of that work are, and giving evidence to this committee through the lens of our audit of Scottish Government would all help to give the committee the assurance that you're looking for. And I do think the issues you heard about last time, particularly around compliance and collection, are difficult ones for a tax system which is designed to operate on a UK-wide basis. My view is that the most important aspects of that for this committee to pursue are about the way in which Scottish taxpayers are being identified and maintained, as that will be a key foundation for the new tax to work properly. That the committee also has a very proper interest in levels of service to Scottish taxpayers, particularly in relation to the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax. But the question of compliance and collection in the middle would be harder to unpick in relation to the Scottish tax alone.
How soon will the agreement be reached? The Memorandum of Understanding, or whatever you intend to call it?
Memorandum of Understanding between us and the NAO is something which is under discussion at the moment but can't be finalised until the arrangements for putting in place the tax itself work through. So probably, I would guess, at the beginning of 2015-16, around a year from now. A lot of what we do will follow from the agreements being developed and worked up between the Scottish Government and HMRC.
That's very late in the process, and there's a lot happening between now and then. Will you be given the same level of access now ahead of signing any memorandum as you would gain after a memorandum is signed?
At the moment, there's no audit work, if I can put it that way, in formal terms going on. What the NAO are doing with HMRC and we're doing with Scottish Government is staying close to their preparations and discussing and seeking to influence the arrangements that will be in place. Russell and Mark can tell you more about the detail of that, as can Alistair from the Scottish Government's point of view. We will be reporting during the 2014-15 audit of Scottish Government on the state of preparation that's currently in place. And if we had any concerns about those preparations, that would be the place in which we would report it to you. But for now, until the tax comes in, what we're auditing is the state of preparation which is underway.
And can I ask Mr Brown, from a Scottish Government perspective, how engaged are you in making sure that the systems which have been set up will accurately identify and return the appropriate levels of the Scottish rate of income tax?
Well, I would describe our level of engagement as pretty thorough, Convener. There are arrangements within HMRC to manage and oversee their programme of work on the Scottish rate of income tax. The work's overseen by a programme board chaired by a senior HMRC official, and I sit on that programme board, obviously get all the papers and participate in discussions. Jonathan is a member of the project board, which is managing the specific Scottish rate project, and again, we see all the papers. Key decision points are flagged up to us in advance, and we have the opportunity to consider the pros and the cons within the Scottish Government, if necessary, to discuss these with colleagues who have specific knowledge. And HMRC have been, I would say, constructive and helpful in giving us time to examine issues and to help us to understand what the implications of these issues are. Specifically on the matter of identifying Scottish taxpayers, we're, I would say, right in the middle of the process at the moment of discussing with HMRC and responding to their proposals around the detail of that process. It's important, obviously, for the reason that you and the Auditor General have said, the identification of Scottish taxpayers is central to this whole endeavour. Identifying them correctly in the first place and then keeping the list of Scottish taxpayers up to date is obviously very important too. So a lot of effort is going into that, and we're scrutinising pretty closely what HMRC are suggesting and coming back with our proposals for how things might be made more accurate or more specific.
I think from what we've heard at our previous meeting and also from comments today from the Auditor General that, you know, this is a complex issue. It's a very technical issue, and clearly that requires a degree of knowledge of systems, of procedures, and of the way that financial regulations work. Now, I know that within the civil service there is how would you say, a history of giving people a taste of or experience of different departments, so people can move from prisons to education or to fisheries or whatever. But given the complexities and the details that are involved in this, can you assure us that the key people who are involved from the Scottish Government side either have the relevant experience of taxation or are qualified accountants?
I don't personally have experience in taxation, nor am I a qualified accountant. But I have colleagues who are, and we, in particular, we have access to tax expertise through Revenue Scotland, recently formed on an administrative basis, and Revenue Scotland now has its Chief Operating Officer, who's Nikki Harrison, recruited last spring from HMRC. So I do have a source of Scottish-based tax knowledge and expertise that I can go to help me with any particularly technical issues. What I would say, though, in response to the generality of your point, is that the process by which one goes about identifying Scottish taxpayers is actually got to do with where people live, rather than the complexities of a tax system. And the issues that we're discussing with HMRC are general rather than technical. Now, clearly, there are other issues to do with how the UK HMRC pay-as-you-earn system and other elements of the income tax system operate, which are deeply technical. And when it comes to these issues, we look for assurance from HMRC and descriptions of how their systems work, but they then are responsible excuse me, for the integrity and accuracy of the internal operation of their systems.
And within, you've explained about Revenue Scotland, but within the Finance Directorate, you know, are the key people that you have around you either people who are experienced in taxation, or are they qualified accountants?
I certainly have colleagues who are qualified accountants.
No, I'm talking about the key people involved in this particular project. Are they qualified accountants?
Neither I nor Jonathan are qualified accountants. However, Jonathan is an economist and a financial analyst, which is, I would suggest, as relevant as specific accounting skills in this context.
Okay, thank you.
Could I also add on that? I think, as Alistair said, there are, as you say, clearly elements of this project which require a good, an in-depth working knowledge of HMRC's tax systems, and we are reliant on HMRC in the first instance on that. Although, I've been on this project for a long time now, and I'm developing those skills myself. But what we add is kind of the scrutiny of what they're doing, but we have to take some of the work that they do on trust. But as, in fact, both Alistair and Caroline have said, one of the most important elements of the project is in being able to identify Scottish taxpayers. And HMRC themselves would say that's linked to how their systems work, but is actually a new task for them. And so there are areas of that project which actually the Scottish Government have much more expertise on and are adding value to the project. So one of the important things is thinking about, once it's running, being able to identify the number of people who move in and out of Scotland through the year and between years. And that's heavily reliant on our own migration data and our own analysis of that. So that's an example of, in this project, where HMRC come to the Scottish Government for our expertise. And hopefully we take some reassurance from that.
I think what the committee heard from HMRC at our last meeting was actually very encouraging. There was a very positive attitude, a willingness to work and to cooperate. And I don't think we heard anything that would give us, in a sense, a cause for concern. But ultimately, we have two parties involved in this process that will have different sets of responsibilities and who are accountable to different political masters. Now, in that kind of situation where there is tension about to whom are people accountable and on whose behalf are they operating, is it not a bit naive just to operate, as you've suggested, on the basis of trust? I'm not suggesting that HMRC will be trying to do anything disreputable, but at the same time, you will have a responsibility to the Scottish Government and to Scottish taxpayers. And if you're telling us that you're operating on the basis of trust, then it would suggest that you actually don't have access to all the facts.
Yeah. What I would suggest is that we operate on the basis of trust but verify, as President Reagan used to say quite a long number of years ago. And clearly, part of that verification is through formal audit processes. And as an example of that, you asked a question earlier about the statutory amendment that the UK Government is bringing forward to in the 2014 Finance Bill to do with the responsibilities of the Controller and Auditor General, the NAO. That amendment lays the obligation on the NAO to report on HMRC's work on the Scottish rate, starting from, if I've got this right, financial year 2014-15. So at the end of that financial year, so we're getting into the summer or autumn of 2015, the NAO will audit the work that HMRC have done in preparing for the Scottish rate. Obviously, they won't be running it yet by that time, but they will have taken forward their preparatory work. In particular, they will have taken forward by that time a lot of work on identifying Scottish taxpayers, and the NAO will be responsible for auditing that work and producing a report on it. So there is that degree of verification going on, and obviously there's the role of Audit Scotland in cooperating with NAO to make sure that we think in Scotland that the work of the NAO is sufficiently is appropriate. That would be one example of verification.
Okay, thank you. Well, not to Colin Beattie. Colin.
Thanks, Convener. Audit operates generally on the basis of certainty, and where there is less than certainty, the second best is to audit and test processes and procedures that result in the outcome that we're seeing. When we had NAO here, they were very clear that they would look at the processes in terms of identifying Scottish taxpayers, which is obviously critical to this whole thing. they did say they would not give any certification or undertaking that it had been done correctly. They would not give any comfort over the process. They would look at it, but that would be it. Now, it seems that there seemed to be a whole limitation around that, which is a concern. I think there's a gap there in terms of identifying the Scottish taxpayers. There's a gap where the HMRC are talking about their inability to disaggregate information about either their compliance activity or tax at risk in respect of Scottish taxpayers employed by UK-wide employers. There seems to be a lot of gaps there, and it is not clear, and it wasn't clear from what NAO said, that they were actually going to be either capable or willing to plug those gaps in terms of audit. And I'd be interested to hear any comment on that.
I'll kick off, if I may, Convener, on that point. And I think you're right, Mr Beattie, that there is a tension in there. And it goes back to my opening comment that we're looking at a UK-wide tax, a shared tax base, part of the proceeds of which will come to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. And if I can try and put it simply, the nub of the challenge is that the estimated receipts of that tax are currently about £4.5 billion against a total income tax of something like £112 billion, I think. So very material in Scottish terms, but actually not material in relation to the UK as a whole. Obviously of huge interest and concern to both the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. And that question of how we can work with the NAO to give you assurance about that sum of the income tax receipts alongside the assurance that the NAO gives to the UK Parliament about the overall receipts is at the heart of what we're trying to resolve here. The view that I would take is that the amendment to the Scotland Act that's being proposed in the Finance Bill does focus on the right issues. It focuses on the correctness of the amounts that are identified as being the proceeds of the Scottish rate of income tax, the costs of collecting them, and the ability for the NAO to carry out value for money studies of the way the system operates. But there is still that sort of two-tier focus on what's material for the UK government and what's material for the Scottish Parliament. And the NAO, I think, in giving evidence to you and in discussion with us, has been clear that it can't give the usual form of audit opinion, a true and fair view opinion, about the proceeds of the Scottish rate of income tax, because it is a relatively small part of HMRC's overall operations, and it will be collected as part of the overall income tax system, the overall collection of personal taxes. We can compensate for that to a great extent, I think, by the mechanisms we've discussed, which is us working closely with the NAO, as we already do, to understand the work they're planning to carry out, the risks they're addressing, the judgments they'll be making, to discuss with them when they've done that work the results of it and the conclusions they're drawing, and to supplement their reporting to this Parliament with our own report on that, if you'd find it useful. All of that, I think, is entirely appropriate in terms of giving this Parliament the assurance that it wants and needs about the way its interests are being looked after by HMRC in that process. But we don't have direct access to HMRC, and there are real challenges in doing so because of the taxpayer confidentiality issue. And I think that's why this stage of discussing the way it will work in practice, what the form of reporting might be, and making sure that the mechanisms are nailed down for this committee to explore with me, with the Comptroller and Auditor General at a UK level, and with HMRC, what's happening in the way you discussed last time.
I recognise what you say in UK terms as small potatoes, but equally, as you also said, to us here it's very significant. And there is a responsibility, certainly from an audit point of view, to ensure that this is right and that it has been properly audited. Now, I realise you're still in discussions on this, but I think it's a key matter. I mean, this is the Audit Committee. We have to be satisfied that someone has signed off saying that this is fair, this is right, it's been done properly, the processes have been followed, and hopefully, as a consequence, the results are correct. Now, I don't see that at this moment we're in that position.
I think you're right that we're not fully there yet. I can give you the assurance that I take that responsibility to look after this committee's and this Parliament's interests very seriously, as you would expect. And I'm very comfortable with the extent to which colleagues in the National Audit Office and in HMRC are open to working with us to put together a system that does what you require. And I think it's right to note that there is that tension in the way this tax is constructed that we need to be aware of in putting those safeguards together. I think we'll all be in a clearer position 12 months from now to identify exactly how the arrangements will work in practice, but we are trying to make something quite unusual work in ways that are both cost-effective and, most importantly, really fulfil that democratic accountability to the Parliament that's necessary here.
Are you including in this discussion the question of the disaggregation?
Disaggregation of?
Where we're talking about where it's a UK-wide company.
That's a really interesting question. We were listening closely to the evidence 2 weeks ago from HMRC about the way in which compliance and collection work. And I think we came away with a great deal of comfort that not only is HMRC not likely to be applying a differential approach to Scottish taxpayers versus taxpayers in the rest of the UK, but actually it would be quite difficult for them to do that because of the way their compliance and collection works. I think our interest really has moved upstream to that whole question of how you identify a Scottish rate taxpayer in the first place and how you make sure that information remains up to date. And that's certainly something we'll be discussing very closely with colleagues in the NAO over the next 12 months as that identification process gets underway.
Clearly, as everybody around this table has identified, the key to this is identifying the Scottish taxpayers. This question of disaggregation is quite significant because we don't know how that will impact overall on the various statistics we receive, the compliance issues, the tax at risk. You know, all these calculations we won't be able to have full reliance on or understanding of the overall position if we don't have disaggregation.
I think that's probably a question that Alistair's better to answer than we are at this stage.
Yeah, I'll do my best to provide some sort of an answer to Mr. Beattie's question. When we were, the context I think in which you're raising the issue of disaggregation is compliance, and just to check that is what you have in mind, and to play back some of the evidence that was given to you by HMRC and National Audit Office officials a fortnight ago. What they said, and we understand this to be the case, is that approximately 99% of income tax is collected automatically through computerised systems or through self-assessment returns, with self-assessment taxpayers paying their tax in that way. The compliance activity of HMRC, therefore, relates to the 1% of income tax that doesn't come in, you might say, automatically. And Edward Troop, I think, explained how a lot of the compliance activity has to do with checking the pay-as-you-earn systems, PAYE systems operated by employers, to see if they've operated the arrangements correctly. And he gave the example of including taxable allowances, for example, in the calculation that generates the monthly pay-as-you-earn payover from an employer's payroll system to HMRC. And what happens in practice is that HMRC adopts a risk-based approach to auditing employers, and it will identify groups of companies that it sees as potentially of higher risk, and it will put compliance resource into checking the pay-as-you-earn computer systems and associated clerical systems operated by these employers, and it will look for errors or misapplications of the rules that would result in an under-return, an under-calculation and an under-return of tax. And all of that's happening within this 1%. The point that HMRC would make is that they go at this from an employer point of view rather than a taxpayer point of view. So if an employer shows certain characteristics that indicate that there might be a heightened risk of error in tax calculations, then HMRC will apply compliance resource to that employer. Now, the employer, if it is a local firm in England, is unlikely to employ Scottish taxpayers. If it's a local firm in Scotland, it will employ Scottish taxpayers. If it's a national organisation, it will employ both Scottish and rest of UK taxpayers. HMRC's point is that they would then find it very difficult indeed if, for example, they intervene through compliance activity with a national employer and a cheque for £100,000 is sent to make up for some error in the way that pay-as-you-earn has been operated for the last year. They would find it very difficult to say how much of that £100,000 related to Scottish taxpayers employed by that company and how much related to non-Scottish taxpayers. It would be possible with a good deal of clerical work to arrive at a figure. You might choose, for example, to divide the money up by reference to the proportion of Scottish taxpayers on that employer's payroll. But how much further forward you would then be as a result, I think, would be a question. If the committee would indulge me too, I think there's an important point here about the 1%, which is the figure that the HMRC has used.
There. Could I clarify? I seem to remember it was 10% on self-assessment.
Yes.
Would the clerks have that figure there?
It is the 99% is the proportion of income tax that comes in automatically through pay-as-you-earn and self-assessment without any further follow-up work by HMRC.
Okay, so the 1% is where there is an intervention.
Exactly.
Okay, that's slightly different.
Yeah.
Because it seemed to go, Mr. Troop said it was 90% came in PAYE, 10% on self-assessment, and then there was a small fraction where the HMRC intervened in any way.
Where there's compliance work. Yeah. Yes, that's as I understand it.
But of course, in terms of disaggregation, it's the 10% overall that theoretically.
Well, overall,
the problem.
Sorry. Overall, the 99% will absolutely be allocated to either Scottish taxpayers or non-Scottish taxpayers. HMRC's computer systems will be able to calculate very accurately how much of the payover made by an employer or by a self-assessment taxpayer is attributable to the Scottish rate. They will be able to calculate that to a penny, and the auditors will be able to check that that routine works as expected. The issue of disaggregation applies to the 1%, where the money comes in not as a result of automatic income tax processes, including self-assessment taxpayers sending their cheques or making their credit transfers, but the 1% where the money comes in as a result of compliance activity, compliance intervention by HMRC. And the difficulty that they have there is that in most of the money that comes in as a result of compliance activity comes in from an employer without being disaggregated among the employees, some of whom will be Scottish taxpayers, some of whom will not. So that's the issue that the HMRC comes to. Now, if the committee would just bear with me for a moment longer, on this 1% of income tax receipts that come in following intervention by HMRC, in general, these receipts come into HMRC more than a year after the end of the tax year to which they relate, which is understandable. If there's been a dispute or a disagreement, or HMRC have mounted an inquiry and have sent officers into an employer, it takes a while for that work to be carried out. And if there is in fact tax underpaid, if that's the conclusion reached by HMRC and they raise an assessment with that employer to pay the balance, then it might be many months and indeed years before that money is settled and comes in. And the UK government's proposal as to how the Scottish rate of income tax should operate overall, financially, is that the amount of Scottish rate received should be struck at a point in time that is, their proposition is, and this is in their command paper back in 2010, is at that point would be reached 1 year after the end of the tax year to which is in question. So for tax year 16-17, which will be the first year in which Scottish rate is applied, the end of that tax year is in at the beginning of April 2017, and HMRC will count all the receipts, all the Scottish rate receipts, throughout that year and onwards until the beginning of April 2018. And at that point, they will settle up. They'll say what the Scottish rate receipts are. And at that point also, they'll prepare an estimate of what the unpaid amount of tax is, the amount of tax that is still in dispute. And their best estimate is that that is 1%. And they will then add that estimated 1% onto the actual receipts of Scottish rate of income tax. And that will be the amount that the Treasury use to calculate our block grant. Now, this is pretty complex, and I apologise for that, but I think it's important to lay hold of the point that if, for example, there was a complete failure to collect any of that 1% in practice, I'm not saying this would happen, but were there to be so, the Scottish budget wouldn't suffer, because an estimate will already have been made of the amount of the 1%, and that will have been added to the actual Scottish rate receipts that were received up until the 1 year point.
Clearly there's a couple of audit issues here that I believe the committee should keep in front of it and come back to at a later point, because obviously, as Auditor General says, the area that she's discussing is going to take some time before that can be properly clarified and resolved. But I think from an audit point of view, it's something we need to keep an eye on. There are gaps.
Okay, thank you. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you very much. Can I first of all say I'm very pleased to hear that there has been and is ongoing positive and constructive engagement, and that's what we heard from HMRC and NEO, and I think taxpayers and businesses in Scotland would expect no less, but I find that very reassuring. But secondly, and it really is a follow-on to Colin Beattie's question, and it's on the performance information. We've previously, there's been quite a bit of discussion around this, but in relation to compliance, prosecution rates, error and fraud levels, tax gap, debt rule, taxes written off, I appreciate that significant preparation is being made, significant progress is being made, and I appreciate that we're looking at what satisfies the Scottish Government, but also what satisfies Audit Scotland in terms of good governance of the Scottish economy. And I wonder if at this stage, is there any information which Audit Scotland and indeed the Scottish Government are seeking, but HMRC and NEO are sort of saying, no, it's just far too difficult? Is there something that is essential to the good governance of the Scottish economy which is being refused, or which is difficult? And perhaps if you could both answer.
I'm not aware of any information that would fall into that category that is essential to correct operation of the Scottish rate, and which we are not being given access to. There is information which HMRC have explained to us, and indeed they've explained to the committee, is quite difficult to obtain from automated systems. And we've asked them about that information. They've given us responses which I think are consistent with what they've said to the committee, so they're not telling us anything different from what they would say in public. And just to give an example of that, because I think it's always helpful to offer an example, I would go back to the answer I attempted to give to Mr Beattie in relation to compliance. HMRC obviously put effort into compliance work, and they're closely examined on their compliance work. It's an issue that the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee takes an interest in, and the yield from their compliance work is a big issue which they're audited on. They have to justify the investment they make in compliance by reference to the yield that they get from that. But what they're saying to us in relation to their compliance work on Scottish rate is that it will be quite difficult to disaggregate it, the point that Mr Beattie was making earlier. And they've explained the reasons for that. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that we can see the logic behind their reasoning, that if they're dealing with a compliance situation, they generally do so from the point of view of the employer, and their tax recovery, if they get extra tax back, is from the employer as a whole. It's not attributed to individual employees, and obviously it's only at the level of the individual employee that one is able to see whether a taxpayer is a Scottish taxpayer or not. So that would be an example of information which ideally it would be good to have. HMRC have explained why that information is not available, and their explanation has been cogent from my point of view.
You're quite satisfied with that explanation?
Yes, I'm satisfied with it. If issues arose in future as to the compliance activity of HMRC and any suggestion that it was differentiated between Scottish firms, for example, and non-Scottish firms, then that's something clearly that we would take up. But we have HMRC's assurance that their compliance activity is risk-based, and as they've said in public, it would be applied in the same way, pound for pound, to employers and employees in Scotland as it would to any other part of the UK. And indeed, most of their compliance activity is broadly sectoral, so they might identify a particular sector of businesses who, with whom there may have been issues in the past about the accuracy of tax calculation. They would look at that sector of business across the UK. They wouldn't concentrate on any region.
The Auditor General.
Sorry.
Thank you, Convener. I agree entirely with Alistair's comments in relation to collection and compliance. I think it's worth restating the importance of the identification and maintenance of Scottish rate taxpayers, which will be critical to this, and I think it will be important to have good performance information there. I also said in my response to the committee last year that although it would be difficult to break down service performance information between Scottish taxpayers and others, because we will all be both in Scotland under this regime, it would be helpful to have information on complaints specifically about the Scottish rate of income tax, because they could be a very useful marker of the way the system's operating across the piece. That may require some additional data collection by HMRC, but in my view it would be worth exploring the costs of collecting that, because I think it could be very helpful both to government and to Parliament in providing assurance that it's working as intended.
Could I perhaps just go back to Alistair Brown to ask if that is an issue that you have discussed with NEO or HMRC?
Yes, Jonathan, do you want to?
Yes, we have. We had a workshop with HMRC just before Christmas, and it is something they're looking at in terms of how they work with their current phone-based system and how you can be able to track those calls which are specifically to do with the Scottish rate versus those calls which are general calls from Scottish taxpayers about the UK tax system. It is quite a tricky issue in terms of being able to disaggregate the two. But they're certainly looking at how to do it, and it's something we're keeping a close eye on.
Willie Coffey?
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could just continue with this issue about the level of assurance we're actually getting. The discussion seems to be focusing in on whether we can't identify who the Scottish taxpayers actually all are. But what kind of level of assurance is it then we get ultimately if we don't know who the Scottish taxpayers are? And Auditor General, did you say in your response to my colleague Colin Beattie that it's not the usual level of assurance or something like that? I wonder if you could clarify that for me, please.
And I'll ask Russell Frith to come in a moment on this as our professional lead person on audit matters. What the amendment to the Scotland Act that's proposed in the Finance Bill requires is for the Comptroller and Auditor General in the NAO to prepare a report on a number of matters which must be covered, and to give him a discretionary power for looking at value for money issues which he may consider. Now, that's not the same as the usual requirement that he has and we have to audit a body and prepare an opinion on the financial statements, although it can give you a good deal of assurance. I'll ask Russell to talk you through the distinction there.
Thank you. Yeah, this will be an unusual audit for the NEO in that they are auditing an extract from a set of accounts. They audit the whole HMRC set of accounts. There are certain numbers within that set of accounts that will relate to the Scottish rate of income tax, but those numbers are individual numbers. They do not themselves form a separate, discrete set of accounts. That's one of the reasons why the amendment is as it is, and therefore what it's done is require the NAO to report specifically on the adequacy of HMRC's rules and procedures and the correctness of the sums brought to account. And that first part about the adequacy of HMRC's rules and procedures in place, and also that those rules are being complied with, is very important in relation to the identification and maintenance of the identification of the Scottish taxpayers. So when we would be discussing with the NAO the scope of their work and later on their findings, for me, we should be concentrating our efforts on ensuring that they are doing enough work on those key risk areas, of which the identification of the Scottish taxpayers is the main one, to provide a similar level of assurance on that as they would be on any other part of, or we would be on any other part of the expenditure or income of the Scottish administration. So what we're looking to achieve similar levels of comfort, but in professional terms, we would have to use slightly different words from what we would for a full set of accounts. So my overall expectation of this process of what the NAO are required to do and what we will do in providing hopefully constructive challenge and review of what they're doing is that you will end up with the same level of comfort in relation to the SRIT figures as you would for anything else that you're considering as a committee.
I think I follow that. I would expect the same rigour to be applied to systems and processes and so on and so forth, but I'll come back to the point about we don't actually know who the Scottish taxpayers are. I can't see, and I'm sure that anybody in the public listening or watching this would probably ask the same question. How can you possibly give an assurance about the correctness of the sums, as you put it, Mr. Frith, if we don't know the numbers of people involved?
One of the areas that we would expect both HMRC and the NAO to be looking at is how you identify those taxpayers to a sufficient degree of accuracy. There are lots of other areas of audit where we are looking for things that might be there but aren't being disclosed. It's not that in itself is not unique. Those Scottish taxpayers that have identified themselves, provided the Scottish rate of tax remains the same as the UK one, there is no incentive particularly for people to declare themselves to be Scottish taxpayers or not, because they pay the same amount. Where the risk really increases is where the Scottish rate of income tax differs from that is being applied in the rest of the UK. If, for example, the Scottish rate was higher, then you might expect there to be a move of people who no longer consider themselves to be Scottish taxpayers. We would therefore expect both HMRC and the NAO to be focusing on the reasons for those movements and the acceptability of those movements. And similarly, in the opposite direction, if the Scottish rate was to be lower, you might expect a lot of people to start declaring themselves Scottish taxpayers who hadn't previously. So from an audit risk point of view, it's looking predominantly at the movements in Scottish rate taxpayers and looking at the reasons for them. That is, once you've got over the initial process of identifying the core Scottish taxpayers first time round. And for that, we'll be looking to HMRC to develop their approaches to looking at for example, their address databases, and in particular for how they will test those people who they have not identified through their initial trawl.
Okay. Just lastly on that point, Convener, I'm just referring to a submission from the HMRC team in June 13, and it was in relation to this issue about the tax gap that I think my colleague Colin Beattie raised, the difference between tax due and tax collected. They say there, quite clearly that they would not have sufficient data to make meaningful estimates in respect of Scottish taxpayers alone. So, I mean, when you're making a statement like that, I would therefore suggest to you that that raises questions about the quality of the whole assurance that can be given to the Scottish Parliament and to the Scottish public and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I don't know if we'll get any closer to that, and we're effectively doing the best we can with this, but it's almost as if we're being handed the responsibility here, but been asked to wear dark glasses, or in some cases a blindfold, into our ability to see what's going on. If we can't get the complete picture, how can we give the assurance? I think would be my final question on that issue, Convener.
I could offer the first part of an answer to Mr Coffey's question, and the Auditor General might want to come in too on that. The written statement that Mr Coffey quotes from, as I recall, was explaining something of the mechanics or the dynamics of how tax compliance operates. So again, we're talking about the 1% of income tax receipts which require intervention, compliance intervention by HMRC. And what HMRC are saying is that they don't expect to have a detailed breakdown of the results of their intervention activity by reference to the status of the taxpayer. So that they'll know what effort they put into income tax compliance work, and they'll know what the yield is from that, but they won't be able to say, and 10% of that yield is attributable to Scottish taxpayers. They won't have that data. What they would be able to say is that, on average, taking a number of years together, the yield from income tax compliance is a percentage of their total income tax receipts. And the estimate that they've used in discussion with the committee is 1%. So looking back over previous years, they would expect to raise something like 1% of total income tax receipts from compliance activity. And what they would also say is that they've got no information that suggests that Scottish taxpayers and people who employ Scottish taxpayers are more or less likely to be the subject of compliance activity. And therefore a reasonable extrapolation is that 1% of Scottish rate income, that is the income from the Scottish rate of income tax, 1% of that can safely be estimated to come in through compliance activity. In other words, the Scottish rate is a representative sample of UK income tax as a whole. Now, that's what I understand the HMRC evidence to be conveying, but the Auditor General may want to comment on that.
Just to add to that briefly, Alistair's right about the compliance element of the tax gap. My understanding is that it also includes estimates made by HMRC about the effect of tax avoidance schemes and of what they term the hidden economy, cash transactions that are never declared, and that they don't feel it would be possible to disaggregate those figures to show the effect for Scottish taxpayers or the Scottish rate of income tax against that for the rest of the UK. I don't think that's a surprise to us. Again, it's one of the features of collecting the Scottish rate of income tax on a shared tax base through a shared and common system. The broader question you raised about the absolute importance of identifying who Scottish taxpayers are, we can only agree with wholeheartedly. And as Russell said, there is that first exercise to go about making sure that there is a complete database of Scottish taxpayers who are eligible to pay the new Scottish rate of income tax when it's introduced in 2016. That information hasn't been needed in the past because there's never been a tax of that kind. That will be a major focus of interest for the National Audit Office and for us under the new clause in the Finance Bill. And once that initial exercise is complete and we're satisfied with it, the focus will shift to how HMRC makes sure it's kept up to date against the background of the potential risks that Russell's identified that may give individual taxpayers an incentive either to opt in to registration as a Scottish taxpayer or to attempt to opt out of it, as far as the compliance activity would focus on that and reduce and minimise the possibility of it.
Could I ask a question, finally, Convener, on the role for Audit Scotland itself in this process? When we embarked on this, I think members around the table were keen to make sure that the role for Audit Scotland in this entire process was positive and influential and so on and so forth, and there was a real role for you there to play. And I'm referring to your own response, Auditor General, to the question we put to you on that matter, and you say in your response that Audit Scotland could discuss with the National Audit Office their planned work in areas relating to the SRIT. I think I was perhaps hoping for more of a formal role for you, and I don't want to suggest duplication of effort that was raised, Convener, in some of the responses. But I think in terms of your role in providing assurance to us, I was certainly hoping for a more positive and proactive role for your organisation in giving us that overview, because I can look forward to a meeting of this committee in future where perhaps we have colleagues from the United Kingdom Department in front of us, but you wouldn't have a role in that, and I would be a wee bit concerned about that. I would certainly like to suggest, Convener, that at some point that if reports are laid before the Scottish Parliament from our UK departments, that your agency has some kind of oversight or ability to report or reflect on that and give your opinion on the worth and accuracy and so on of that for us. Otherwise, we would be losing, I think, the valuable input that Audit Scotland has given this committee over many years.
I understand that aspiration entirely, and I think all of our thinking has moved on since the response last summer. Where we've got to now, I think, is a very clear understanding with the NAO, HMRC and Scottish Government that our role would be to discuss with the National Audit Office the work they need to do to fulfil the new requirements under the Finance Bill. That we would have the chance to influence the work there, respecting the Comptroller and Auditor General's discretion, reflecting mine to make his own decisions about the work that he will do. That there will be a second formal discussion once the work has been complete to understand the findings and the reporting that's due to come from that. And I think alongside the report which would come to this committee from the National Audit Office on the HMRC's extract of accounts, I would be very happy to provide my own report, either giving you the assurance that we were fully content with the work the National Audit Office had done, or raising with you any questions about either the coverage of their work or the findings of their work that I thought you ought to be aware of. My powers already enable me to do that. I think it would be useful to capture it in a memorandum of understanding once the new arrangements are in place from 2015 onwards. But I hope that would give you a higher level of assurance than you're suggesting at the moment, without getting into the complexities of Audit Scotland's statutory rights of access to HMRC as a UK body. I think that can give you the assurance you need that Scotland's interests are being taken fully into account in that audit work. And I am reassured by the commitment that we've experienced so far from both the NAO and HMRC to making that work in your interests as well as the UK Parliament's interests.
Okay, in McIntosh.
Thanks so much, and particularly thank Mr Brown for some of the comments, just to help my understanding for everything else of the new system. Where it's quite complex in that we are here clearly to look at the role of the auditing systems. We haven't introduced the finance systems in the first place, so accountability. So just to, if you don't mind clarifying a couple of issues for me, what's the role of Revenue Scotland? You've seen you can call on their expertise, but what's the role of Revenue Scotland in this?
We don't expect Revenue Scotland to have any formal role or any role in the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax. It's entirely HMRC's responsibility in terms of its collection and the paying over, the calculation of the amount due and paying over. My reference to Revenue Scotland earlier was simply to draw attention to the fact that I had a colleague there who was well versed in UK tax matters.
So just to clarify matters, because clearly the issue of accountability is the one that's sort of vexing us. So just so I clarify matters, the Scottish Government, you and the Scottish Government are the body to whom we hold you accountable for raising SRIT, Scottish income tax. You are, not HMRC, but yourselves. Yeah.
What I would want to remind the committee of is that HMRC have appointed an additional accounting officer, Edward Troop, who was here giving evidence 2 weeks ago, and there is therefore a direct line of accountability from. It's a very special one set up only for the Scottish rate of income tax, but there is a direct line of accountability from Edward Troop on behalf of HMRC to the Scottish Parliament, and obviously that would be exercised largely by this committee.
So do you think that Mr Troop is accountable to the Scottish Parliament? My understanding is that he's accountable to the Scottish Government, and actually it's the Scottish Government that's accountable to this Parliament for raising revenue through SRIT.
My understanding of the position, and I can certainly verify this for the committee, is that the arrangements put in place by HMRC in formally naming Edward Troop as accounting officer, that is an expression of an accounting relationship to the Parliament. If I can lay my hands on anything before the session is finished that confirms that, I'll obviously say so. If not, I would be very happy to send a note to the committee confirming that.
It's just, Caroline looks like she's keen to come in and clarify this point, no, or just...
I was going to add to what Alistair has said by saying that I think there are two lines of accountability. It's clear that HMRC will be collecting this tax, and there are arrangements being put in place to provide accountability to this Parliament. But equally, through my audit of the Scottish Government, I will be looking at the arrangements they have in place, the adequacy of the agreements between Scottish Government and HMRC, the monitoring and oversight of what's going on in ways that can report very directly to this committee. So there are two lines of accountability, both of which are important.
Yes, I'm just to make sure I understand this, because HMRC, it's very helpful that they've appointed Mr Troop. It's very helpful. Mr Morris last week was also very helpful about. They're both clearly willing to come to this Parliament and talk about reports they've laid and so on. But they also made it very clear, and HMRC made this very clear, that they're not answerable in that sense. They're not accountable in that sense. We can't demand of them. They will come if we ask them, but we can't make them come. And it's quite a clear line of accountability, I think. On the other hand, the Scottish Government is answerable. Now, my understanding is, therefore, that although we will have very helpful and informative line of administrative information, as it were, from HMRC, that actual legal accountability, strict accountability, actually is the Scottish Government's responsibility for raising the Scottish rate of income tax. And it's the Scottish Government that's accountable to this Parliament for the amounts raised and the accuracy of those amounts. Now, would I be right or wrong in that?
I think both of those are true, and that, as Russell said, we have a unique tax here, which is set by the Scottish Parliament, but collected by a UK-wide body, and we therefore have unique accountability arrangements. The Scottish Government clearly has an accountability which I will be monitoring through my audit work and reporting to this committee and this Parliament, and the new arrangements being put in place via the National Audit Office for HMRC provide an additional line of accountability to you.
And so just again to clarify that, so in terms of audit responsibility, you will have a working relationship with the National Audit Office, but on top of that, you will actually, you will also audit the Scottish Government on its role in collecting SRIT.
Yes, and we're already looking at part of looking at that through the lens of their preparations for it. Mark Taylor leads for me on the audit of the Scottish Government, and he may want to say a little about the audit work we're planning for the audit year that's just starting in that area.
Thank you, Auditor General. To say, first of all, we're engaged in understanding Scottish Government's arrangements as part of our ongoing audit work, and that continues to be the case. As we get closer to the date, obviously we'll ramp up that engagement and ramp up that understanding. I think where we are at the moment is our focus is very much on the governance arrangements and oversight arrangements and engagement the Scottish Government is having with HMRC at this and how those operate in practice to protect the Scottish interests. I think at this stage we don't have any initial concerns about that, but there's still a lot of work obviously to be done, as we're discussing today, but a lot of work practically to be done, and we'll continue to keep that under review as we go forward. And as the Auditor General says, where we have concerns emerging about that and emerging about how the Scottish Government may be performing that role, we've got clear opportunities to bring that to this committee's attention.
Can I just clarify, perhaps with Mr Taylor or Mr Brown, will the Scottish Government account, will it have a separate line, a distinct line in its accounts, which reveals the specific amount raised by SRIT?
My expectation is that the amount raised by SRIT wouldn't be separately identified in the accounts, because the amount due to the Scottish budget as a result of the Scottish rate will be included in the block grant, which is which is obviously a Treasury matter, and they advise us what the block grant is. We also expect that they'll advise us how they have calculated the block grant. And it's important to bear in mind that the amount added to the block grant will be the amount raised from the Scottish rate less the block grant adjustment, which the UK government will make in recognition of the fact that their exchequer is no longer receiving that proportion of UK income tax. So that our focus is on the net effect of the amount raised through Scottish rate minus the block grant adjustment, because that is what actually impinges on the Scottish budget. So we're also very interested in, obviously, in the calculation of the block grant adjustment, which is a matter, obviously, that the Parliament is interested in, and which the Finance Committee has pursued with us and is pursuing.
Yes, I think we'll be very interested. I mean, there's an incentive built into the new system that if we increase the amount of tax taken in Scotland, we can keep a proportion of that as well. Am I right?
Yes, if the Scottish Parliament approved a resolution which set a Scottish rate at a level different from 10 pence, which is what you're saying, either up or down, then the Scottish budget would see the financial consequences of that. In technical terms, these financial consequences would be calculated by the Office of Budget Responsibility, and we would take a close interest in their calculation. So if a resolution was set, as it has to be before the beginning of the tax year to which it relates, the payover from UK government in the block grant would immediately reflect the calculated impact of a variation in the Scottish rate from 10 pence.
Why would you not report on it directly in the Scottish Government accounts or to this Parliament?
Well, in terms of financial accounting, and Audit Scotland colleagues will be able to keep me right here, the income into the Scottish Government's budget, which it then spends, our funding is at the moment is simply a single line of funding from Treasury. That obviously is in future will be made up from a calculation involving the Scottish rate. But in terms of our accounts, the source is Treasury's block grant. How Treasury calculate that is something that is upstream from our accounts. I mean, that's not at all to say that there won't be information available, but it might not be in our accounts.
Can I say something?
Bring in the Auditor General.
How will we be able to check this?
You certainly should be able to check it, and the committee may recall that in my submission last summer on this issue, my final point was the importance of making sure there was transparency about the proceeds from the Scottish rate of income tax and the consequent adjustment to the block grant that comes through. There's the question of the accounting treatment, which I think Alistair has described accurately, and there is then the wider question in the way the Scottish Government reports that as part of the broader information that this Parliament and we all as citizens and taxpayers need to understand the state of the Scottish public finances and as a basis for decision making in future. I think it's very important there is that transparency there, and we'll be keeping an eye on that through our audit work over the next couple of years.
Mr. Berman, yes.
Could I add a point to that, please? Convener, I very much agree with what the Auditor General says, and transparency and accurate and full information is very important indeed, and we'll do everything that we can to provide that. Mr Swinney has recently written to the convener of the Finance Committee setting out the information that he expects the Scottish Government will provide to the Parliament in future draft budgets, including information about tax receipts. Now, the immediate context of the letter was devolved taxes, that is, land and buildings transaction tax and Scottish landfill tax. But what he said in that letter was that he expected the same provision of information in relation to Scottish rate once it starts a year later in 2016. So, in a word, the Scottish Government is saying that it will provide all the relevant information that it has about actual and forecast Scottish rate receipts at draft budget time, normally in September.
Just to clarify, what is the mechanism, the process by which we will see this calculation? Will it be provided by the government through the budget papers? Will we actually have to go to the National Audit Office? I can't work out Is it the report laid by the NAO before us, or is it a Scottish Government report laid before us that provides the vehicle through which we can make our own judgment, our own scrutiny of the calculation that's been made about the amount raised in SRIT?
Well, the Parliament would have information in the draft budget some 6 months before the beginning, or 7 months before the beginning of the financial year, about the details of the calculation which we had been provided by Treasury of both the Scottish rate and the block grant adjustment.
And I think that as we are developing this new world of greater financial autonomy for Scotland, there is a question too about the way the Scottish Government's financial reporting develops to reflect that. I published a report last June on this, which the committee took evidence on. This is one of the issues that we'd identified as needing further thought, and we're engaged with government on that. My sense is that the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to producing more information at budget stage is welcome, but there is a further discussion to be had about the broader financial reporting, the way in which the proceeds of the Scottish rate of income tax are transparent to Parliament and others with an interest, the impact on the reconciliation of the block grant, and the broader picture of the state of Scotland's public finances. That's good practice in any case, but it becomes increasingly important as we have more financial autonomy, more decisions to make, and more volatility risk to bear in that context.
Can I just clarify one other issue, which is
last point.
Well, it's about this 1%. It's going to take more than one question, I'm afraid, Convener. Sorry to...
I'll be quick then, okay.
Your face stinks in despair there. I think Mr Brown clarified this already. The 1% that we've been talking about earlier, the Treasury calculate that because 1% is effectively what they raise in compliance every year. That's where the 1% comes from. Yes. Because I think in evidence last week, in fact, it was Sarah Walker was saying to us in evidence last 2 weeks ago that even a year after the end of the tax year, they'll still not, most of that 1% will not have been collected. So they'll still be making an estimate even at that stage. Now, you were saying earlier, I think it's 4.5 billion is the SRIT, so we're talking about £45 million would be 1%. So how do we check whether it is 1% or it's 2% or it's 0.5%? How do we check that?
The proposition, as we understand it, from HMRC and from Treasury, who are involved in this also, is that by looking through a number of years' data from income tax collection files or records, HMRC will be able to provide an accurate estimate of, in general, taking 1 year with another, how much of their income tax receipts come in after the plus 1 year cut-off point. And on the assumption that future years are fairly like previous years, they believe that that's an accurate enough basis for estimating the proportion of tax still to come. And they will then uprate the actual receipts by that 1% or whatever it is found to be when there's a fully accurate sampling taken of previous years' data. They will add that to the actual receipts to give the full estimated 100% of Scottish rate receipts.
I think that's quite relatively reassuring. The point that Mr Frith pursued earlier, which is the issue I was raising 2 weeks ago, is the one that's slightly more disconcerting, and that is what happens when we change the rate, or if we were to change the rate, or if there was to be anything else that was to happen in Scotland that was to have a different collection, create different rates of collection. For example, the incentive I was trying to allude to earlier is not just about changing the rate, it's about growing the Scottish economy and reaping the benefits of having a faster growing economy. 1% is the collection rate. In terms of identifying Scottish residents for purpose of tax, I'm assuming the rate is a lot higher than 99%. I'm assuming it's 99.99%. Would I be wrong in thinking that? In terms of identifying residents who are therefore liable to pay income tax in Scotland?
The honest answer is that we don't yet know. There has never been the need in the past to identify Scottish taxpayers. It's an exercise which the government and HMRC are planning at the moment that will be a fundamental building block of the new tax. And it's something that the National Audit Office and we will be taking a close interest in because getting that number right really will be the foundation of the tax being fair and equitable, as well as raising as much as it can for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament's programme of public services and economic development.
So we still don't know. Do we have an estimate of how many we'll be able to identify? Or I think, Jonathan Sewell, earlier, you were suggesting that it's the Scottish Government that's going to do most of the work in identifying these people.
Well, it's HMRC are leading on the work, but we've certainly had a number of sessions with different analysts across the Scottish Government with the different data sets that we have in Scotland, such as NHS data, migration data and the like, which are contributing to this process. It's a process which is still ongoing. There's been some work done by HMRC in cleaning up their database of their addresses, and it's something which I think Mr. Treep said to you 2 weeks ago that he'd be happy to come back and talk you through further to give you more reassurance about it. As to the certainty of what the final number will be, I couldn't tell you at this point because we've not reached that point, but clearly we're driven by an incentive to know the total number of Scottish taxpayers as well as we can, and we'll set those limits when we're further down the line. But clearly we have every incentive to ensure that it's accurate as possible so we get as much money as we do, and that will be for the system. Will have to prove that it'll be a transparent system. As I said, NAO will be looking at it, Audit Scotland will be looking at it, we'll be looking at it. On your point about the risk around a different set of rates between the rest of the UK and Scotland, that is a big risk, and this is a specific line of work is being done with HMRC in terms of how a compliance system might look at that. And I think, as Sarah Walker said to you as well, one thing we do know, in fact, from Scottish Government data, is a reasonable idea about migration data between the rest of the UK and Scotland. And so a clear signal would be that if that starts changing quite differently from what we would expect, then that would be kind of a signal to be doing more compliance work and would give a head start on where it should be based. But this is all still... I mean, a lot of work has been done, but because it's so important, more work has been done to improve the robustness of it.
So I take it here then that the National Audit, the Auditor General, I mean, it's very difficult to audit if we don't know. I mean, because this is going to be crucial when it comes to the bit. When the system's introduced and the rates are the same, you know, I think it's fairly robust and it's a very fair system. But as soon as it changes, it's the change, it's the difference that's caused by change that's actually so important, and that's when fairness comes into it. And it could be quite easy for somebody with 2 homes, for example, to change their place of residence. And if HMRC can't identify it, I can't work out how the Auditor General could then give us the reassurance that their calculations are right.
HMRC have to do it. It's the foundation building block on which the whole system of the Scottish rate of income tax is built. As Alistair and Jonathan have said, it's a big part of the project plan for implementation during 2014-15 to identify who are Scottish rate taxpayers, to test that out, to look for people who may be missing from the database, to look at those people who may be able to claim either status and test out which is the right one. Getting that right will be an initial exercise that's critically important that we and the NAO will have an interest in. We can provide you some assurance about how well that's been done or not at the appropriate point, and the job will then shift for HMRC into one of making sure that changes are appropriate, especially, as you say, if there is a change in the Scottish rate which might give people incentives either way to misstate their place of residence. It's not an easy thing to do. It's also not unprecedented in taxation, but I think it is the key focus of our interest at this stage in the implementation plan.
Thanks very much.
Just before James Donnan comes in, Mr Brown, can I ask you to clarify something you mentioned about Revenue Scotland? You spoke about the domain responsibility being with HMRC. What exactly is the function of Revenue Scotland?
Revenue Scotland exists as an administrative entity at the moment. It will be given a statutory basis through the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill, which has been introduced to the Parliament, and its function will be to collect devolved taxes, of which there are 2 at the moment.
So it will have no input whatsoever to the Scottish rate of income tax?
It will have no role in the collection of Scottish rate. You're right.
So in terms of scrutinising what goes on, we will have an expert tax function set up within the Scottish Government called Revenue Scotland, but they will not make any comment on the significant issues dealing with the Scottish rate of income tax. That will be left to, what, another department of the Scottish Government?
No, just to be clear, the Revenue Scotland will not have a function to do with the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax. However, their colleagues of ours if we decide to ask them for some help or information or comment internally within the Scottish Government, it would be entirely appropriate for us to do that.
Yes, but that's only if you choose to do so.
Yes.
But otherwise, you'll have a separate section within the Scottish Government dealing with the Scottish rate of income tax, and then we will have an expert tax body called Revenue Scotland that will have nothing at all to do with making comment on the Scottish rate of income tax unless you decide to ask.
You're correct that it will have no formal role in collecting the Scottish rate.
No, not. I'm not talking about the collection, because we understand that collection still remains with HMRC, but all the responsibilities and functions that you will have as part of your engagement with the Scottish rate of income tax and ensuring that it's done properly, that it's not that it's collected properly, but you're getting your fair share. All that expertise will be in a separate section within the Scottish Government. It won't be within Revenue Scotland.
No, the expertise will be, as necessary, expertise will be called on from, for example, our Office of the Chief Economic Advisor. So when it comes to forecasting tax receipts at a UK level, that's done by the Office of Budget Responsibility. Within Scotland, our expertise in forecasting lies with our economist colleagues in the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor, so we would go there for expertise on tax forecasting, just as an example. And there may well be issues in which we want to go to our colleagues in Revenue Scotland also.
Formally, Revenue Scotland will have nothing at all to do with any aspect of the Scottish rate of income tax.
Their formal functions don't include Scottish rate.
Okay, thank you. James Dornan.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just get some clarification on a point that Ken McIntosh raised? Ken talked about the tax take, and the response we got was about the tax rate. Can I just clarify that if, for any reason, a future Scottish Government raised the tax, then they would get to keep the money, but if the Scottish economy grew greater than the rest of the UK, that the money for that, we would get the tax back, but then there'd be a readjustment on the block, which would probably nullify the growth?
There's a lot of complexity around that whole issue. What you're raising is the interaction between Scottish rate receipts and the calculation of the block grant adjustment. And just as briefly as I can, for the committee, the Scottish rate receipts will be driven first of all by the tax rate set by resolution of the Scottish Parliament on a proposal from a Scottish minister. The tax rate and then the tax base to which the rate is applied. Now, the tax base effectively is the non-savings, non-dividend income of Scottish taxpayers. So, as the Scottish economy grows and the income of Scottish taxpayers grow, the tax base is increased, and that's all on the side of receipts from the tax. Then offsetting that, there is the block grant adjustment, and the agreement between the two governments, which has been reached at ministerial level and discussed publicly, is that the block grant adjustment will be indexed to movements in the UK tax base. And the effect of that is that if the Scottish economy grows by reference to the UK economy, if both are growing but the Scottish economy grows faster, then there would be benefit to the Scottish budget. If the Scottish economy grew more slowly in comparison to the UK economy, then the block grant adjustment would, by a small margin, exceed the income from Scottish rate.
So can I just clarify then that if the Scottish economy does grow faster than the rest of the UK, the tax benefits would all come back to Scotland?
Yes, they would. The system is designed to deliver that.
Good. Right. Earlier on, the Attorney General, there you go. I was going to say you've been promoted, but I'm not sure if it would be. Solicitor General talked about confidentiality a couple of times. Can I ask, is this a matter of concern? 2 points from it. One is that, is there anybody within the Scottish Government then that will have access to the information that HMRC hold confidential? And secondly, if they don't, is it a matter of concern? Again, we go back to this recognising Scottish taxpayers, but also in terms of are we getting a fair deal? Will this confidentiality work as a block to either of those targets?
I'll kick off from the audit perspective. I'm sure Alistair will want to add to that in terms of the second part of your question. As it stands at the moment, HMRC are very jealous of taxpayer confidentiality for good reason, as we would all expect them to be as taxpayers ourselves. And it's very clearly and tightly defined who has access to taxpayer information. At the moment, the National Audit Office do have statutory rights of access to that information for the purposes required by their audit work. Again, that's closely controlled to make sure that it's used only for those purposes and not more widely. We in Audit Scotland don't have that access, and subject to the agreement of the new audit arrangements in the way that we've discussed this morning, I don't think we need that. I think we can provide you with the assurance that you need about the audit work done by the National Audit Office without needing to look at individual taxpayer records. The broader question of the extent to which the Scottish Government has or may need that access, I think Alistair is better placed to answer for you. But I think the answer from my point of view is that the arrangements we're talking about should give you that assurance about Scotland's fair treatment within a UK system. The question about the impact on the tax management, I think, is Alistair's.
Yes, and I think from our point of view, what we're interested in is anything that would impact on the aggregate of tax receipts. I'm not aware of any way in which the operation of taxpayer confidentiality would cut across our being able to satisfy ourselves or to look for systems or reporting arrangements that satisfied us about that. So the short answer from our point of view is at the moment we don't see confidentiality, proper taxpayer confidentiality on HMRC's part as being something that would block us doing the work we feel we need to do.
That takes me on to a different point then. Have we got any mechanism in place to deal with, for example, if the NEO find that there are a difference or the sums that are attributable to the SRIT are not correct?
Yes, the amendment to the Scotland Act that's proposed in the current finance bill provides them with a duty to report both on the amounts collected under the Scottish rate of income tax and HMRC's procedures and rules for collecting it. And if they found that at a material level there were problems with that collection or the amounts that were reported by HMRC in the extract from their accounts were not correct, they would report that to this Parliament, and I would have the ability to report alongside it to you about the work they've done and my view of the implications for the Scottish Government's finances.
Would there be a role then for the Scottish Government to take that back to HMRC?
If there were disagreements about the administration, collection or whatever of the Scottish rate, then the Memorandum of Understanding, which has been signed, which the committee saw in draft at the end of 2012, puts in place dispute resolution arrangements whereby an issue, if it was raised, would be escalated first of all to senior officials and then, if necessary, to ministers in the Joint Exchequer Committee, which brings together Scottish and UK government ministers. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Volunteer.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning. It's really just taking on the last point here in terms of the function of the Auditor General's office in terms of the information is going to be given to you and you're working through the audit process to bring it back in whatever shape and form. There's a couple of things that I'm not totally clear about in the sense that at what point in the information gathering are you going to be able to audit to, if you like, because obviously there's going to be numbers coming forward that we don't have access to or you won't have access to because it comes through HMRC, and how, given the fact there'll be a top line figure you'll have to work with, how can we actually check back in terms of, we're all politicians here and we all have a punch up wherever we on the odd occasion we're talking about monies, and particularly when you have different types of administration sitting 400 miles apart. So how far back to give this Parliament or this Audit Committee comfort in the knowledge that this information or any changes within policy of gathering, can you go to give us the comfort that the information that's coming over is absolutely correct? And the second question I would ask in terms of how will you, and I'm pretty sure you've had a bash at doing this one before, but the value of the service that we actually get in terms of the data gathering and reporting mechanisms.
I think the first assurance that you have in this committee and the Parliament are the requirements set out in the Finance Bill amendment to the Scotland Act, which very specifically requires my counterpart in Whitehall to audit HMRC's extract of accounts, to provide assurance about the procedures and rules they're using to administer and collect the Scottish rate of income tax, the amounts they're calculating as due to the Scottish Government from that tax, and the amounts that are being billed to the Scottish Government for the marginal costs of running the system. So they have a new responsibility, assuming the legislation is passed, to do those things. The other line of comfort that you have is that my team will be sitting down with the National Audit Office team every year and talking through with them the audit work they plan to do to fulfil those responsibilities. I would expect, based on our existing working relationships, we'd have the chance to drill down and ask questions about the decisions they were making and to suggest areas of work they should consider in carrying out their responsibilities. And we would sit down at the other end of the process to talk through with them what they'd found, what they plan to report, and the implications of that for the Scottish Government. The third and final line of assurance you've got is that when the CNAG's report is laid here in Parliament, I will also be willing and very able to lay a report here which sets out any matters that I think should be drawn to your attention from that process. It may simply say, I'm satisfied that the NAO's work covers the requirements in the Scotland Act as amended, and there's nothing to draw to your attention. But if in the unlikely event I thought there was a concern, I would be able to say in there, I have a concern, for example, that the work done to look at the identification of Scottish taxpayers may not be adequate to give you the assurance you require. I'm not suggesting in any case that's likely to be the outcome, but if it were, there would be a vehicle for me to report to this committee and to the Parliament on the work carried out by the NAO under the new legislation.
Yeah, it was just, sorry.
Could I add a point just on the back of what Caroline Gardner has said in terms of assurance and reassurance that the committee can take? It's relevant to say that there will be a transition period at the beginning of the operation of the Scottish rate of income tax. In the UK Government's command paper published in November 2010, they say that the transition period would be 2 years or 3, and no decision has yet been taken about whether it is 2 or 3 years. But in that period, the fluctuations in the receipts from the Scottish rate of income tax will not affect the Scottish budget, because the point of the transition period is that during it, the block grant adjustment will be set at exactly the same level as receipts from the Scottish rate. So by definition, the net result is 0, and the Scottish budget will therefore not be affected. The point of the transition period is to give an opportunity for systems to settle in and to demonstrate that they are working adequately. And after the end of the transition period, the system becomes real.
Well, thank you very much for what was an unexpectedly long session on a very dry issue, but nevertheless an important one. And you know, we still have some way to go on this, and we look forward to having an update from both the Scottish Government and Audit Scotland as matters develop. So thank you very much for your contribution, and at that I will suspend the meeting for a few minutes to allow a changeover and some comfort. Thank you. Okay. Can I reconvene the meeting and welcome to the committee Paul Gray, Director General of Health and Social Care and the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, and his colleagues. I believe, Mr Gray, that this is your first appearance at a committee of the Scottish Parliament since your new appointment. Can I congratulate you on that? It's an immense challenge, I think, ahead of you, given some of the issues involved, and it's a job and a responsibility which is of significance to every single individual in Scotland. So I know that you will be excited about the prospect. I believe that you wish to make an opening contribution.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you. I appreciate your words of congratulation. It is a privilege and a challenge and a real responsibility. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss the two Audit Scotland reports on financial performance and the management of patients on the NHS waiting lists. As you say, this is my first appearance before this committee in my new role, and I'm very pleased to have the support of John Matheson, who leads on finance, John Connachan, who leads on performance and delivery and workforce, and Dr Aileen Keel, who is our Deputy Chief Medical Officer. I want to assure the committee that we take these sessions very seriously indeed, and I will be feeding back key issues raised today to the chairs and to the Chief Executives of NHS Scotland boards. The NHS Financial Performance 2012-13 report helpfully acknowledges that the NHS managed its overall finances well in the short run, and that for the 5th year running all boards achieved their financial targets. And I also welcome the short key messages document, which I found very helpful, and it includes a number of important recommendations setting out areas for further improvement. However, Convener, I want to assure the committee that I am not by any stretch complacent. I think you referred in an earlier session to Exhibit 15 in the finance report, which in particular shows that there have been areas of significant progress, but also a number of areas where we must continue to improve, and we can say more about what we in the boards are doing to secure that continued improvement should the committee wish. And the public sector does face pressures. Demographic trends alone make that clear. Our significant commitment in the NHS to improvement and service redesign forms part of our response to that, as does our approach to the integration of health and social care, which is of course the subject of legislation in this Parliament. Overall, I believe that the NHS has delivered a strong financial performance which reflects effective financial planning and close partnership working between Scottish Government and the boards. But we always want to do better, and we will work closely with Audit Scotland to address the recommendations highlighted in the report. We're happy to discuss these further if the committee would find that helpful. Turning then to the management of waiting times update, I also welcome the audit report, which clearly highlights significant improvements in the recording, monitoring and reporting of waiting times since the report in February 2013. Significant majority of the recommendations covered by Audit Scotland's previous report, as well as reports of this committee and internal auditors, have been implemented. There do remain a few outstanding actions in a couple of boards relating to IT upgrades. For example, NHS Highland will change over to the Track Care Patient Administration System during this year. As the committee will be aware, our work on waiting times follows one of the most significant audits of public services ever carried out. Millions of individual records were scrutinised over a 2-year period by Audit Scotland and internal auditors. And finally, Convener, I do want to ensure that the people served by NHS Scotland can have confidence in our management and reporting of waiting times. I therefore want to close by assuring the committee that we will not lose focus on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. What's the purpose of your targets, and what status do they have for, for example, your heat standards? What's the point of having them?
I would say, and I'll ask John Connachan to come in on this in a moment, Convener, I would describe 3 purposes. First of all, to ensure that the boards are clear about the performance standards expected of them. Secondly, to be stretching, so they're not simply there as an indicator of what is happening, but there is, in many cases these targets are stretching. And thirdly, and in some senses most importantly, to give the public and Parliament information on which they can confidently assess the performance of the National Health Service. I think it's important that we maintain confidence in the NHS.
So, in terms of confidence then, when we look at the management of patients on NHS waiting lists, the audit update, September 13, not a single health board in Scotland met its target for outpatients having to wait. No outpatient would have to wait more than 12 weeks for their first appointment. You know, where's the confidence when not a single health board meets your target?
Well, the point about having a target is to get the health boards to move towards that. And I'll ask John Connaughton to give you the latest position on outpatients. It's an important matter.
Okay. Thank you. If I can maybe add some remarks on that. Let me reassure the committee that we take targets seriously. There's something for the NHS to aim for and then to deliver on a continuous and sustainable basis. And I think the committee should be aware that Scotland has made tremendous strides over the course of the last 10 years in this. Returning just to the 12-week outpatient target, this is a target that's been with us for some time, for at least 10 years, when we started to seriously take a look at waiting times when outpatient waits of a year and a half, 2 years and indeed 3 years were not uncommon. Over the past few years, however, we have added additional targets to the NHS. One of these is the 18-week referral to treatment target. That's an all-encompassing target, and it also includes an element of outpatient waits. And when we introduced that, we did give some thought to whether or not we needed an additional target for outpatients. We decided to keep it, and the reason we decided to keep it is because it gave us a handle on the entire cohort performance, if I can put it like that. If I was recommending that target today to committee, I might want to consider whether or not we should have attached a small tolerance to it. But leaving that aside, Scotland is performing at 95% against that target. Is that good enough? Clearly the answer is no. Our ambition is to reach 100%, so everyone has an offer of an outpatient appointment within that time period. And I can say a little bit more if you want, Convener, about what we are currently doing with boards to address that situation.
Mr. Gray used the word confidence, that targets are set, apparently, to give the public confidence in the way that the NHS is performing. So, for example, if you look at accident and emergency, you have a target, and yet, of all the major mainland health authorities, Tayside is the only health authority in mainland Scotland to meet your accident and emergency target. So, there are many areas of Scotland that can have no confidence, using Mr. Gray's term, in terms of the 12 weeks. And as far as accident and emergency is concerned, it's leaving aside Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles, it's only Tayside where people can have any confidence in your targets. In the rest of Scotland, that doesn't apply.
I think you're referring to the position over the course of winter 12-13, and I think you're right in saying that Scotland had a relatively tough winter there. We recognise the pressures that were brought into Scotland, the performance element, through increased norovirus and indeed through a significant increase in respiratory illness. So what have we done since these statistics were first brought to light over a year ago? We have worked with boards. I think we've also worked with our partners like the College of Emergency Medicine to produce a much better and more robust plan for this winter. So, Convener, I think if we were looking at the situation a year hence and we're reflecting on this winter, you would find that our planning is much better. That there is now much more confidence in the system, that standard is being maintained, and I think I look forward to seeing what the end of December quarter statistics will show us in relation to that when they are published at the end of February.
So you're suggesting that when we next look at this, or when Audit Scotland next reports on the subsequent year, that for the for the target on no outpatient waiting more than 12 weeks for the first appointment, instead of the list of health boards not meeting the targets, we will see a list of health boards meeting the targets.
That is certainly the plan, Convener. We have got now detailed...
It's always the plan to meet the targets, I assume. I'm not talking about what your plan is. I mean, what I'm asking is, will that in fact happen?
We already know that some of that change is in fact happening. So if I can return to A&D, where we have some statistics already available in the public domain on that. A survey conducted by some of the national press over the course of the last month already indicates that we have seen a significant increase in performance in the NHS this winter. A large reduction in the number of patients breaching that target, and many more boards now reaching it. And of course, we set our ambition out for accident emergency to reach 95% by September 2014. And I think I'm certainly confident in saying to the committee that the next time you look at this, that those statistics will have improved significantly.
You say a survey done by the national press.
Yeah.
Have you done a survey?
We obtain weekly reports from boards. These are management information reports, but we have these validated. We don't normally provide those reports in public until they're validated and published as part of the statistical protocols agreed with ISD. These statistics are published on a quarterly basis, and as I say, the next publication will be at the end of February.
Okay. Mr Gray, can I ask you about legislation? There is now legislation in place on treatment time guarantees. When this Parliament passes legislation, what's the purpose of that legislation?
The purpose of the legislation, among other things, is to state clearly what the will of Parliament is in relation to the matter that is considered.
And you will implement the will of Parliament?
That would be my duty.
So your duty to implement the will of Parliament. Okay, so if we look at the will of Parliament in relation to all eligible inpatients guaranteed to be seen within 12 weeks, why is it that only in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Lanarkshire, Orkney and Shetland and Western Isles, along with the Golden Jubilee Hospital, that they were the only places where that legal guarantee is met, and in the rest of Scotland, the vast majority of the boards, the legal guarantee is not met?
The boards are working towards meeting that, Convener. I accept the point entirely that they're not yet doing so. It is a legal guarantee and they are expending considerable effort in ensuring that they get there. I revert to my point about targets. They're meant to be stretching. If a target was set that everybody met on the first day that it was set, it would scarcely be a target. It would scarcely be a challenge. But I take very seriously the position that Parliament agreed that there ought to be a 12-week treatment time guarantee, and this is another matter which we discuss not just as a matter of routine with boards, but we draw it to their attention both at chairs and chief executives meetings. John Connachan and others responsible for performance management monitor it regularly. It is a target which I would judge ought to be met, and we are working towards that.
You rightly say that targets are for stretching, yeah, and they're challenging, and you're working towards it. And you say that this, in terms of the legal guarantee, that's a target, towards which you should be working. But actually, there's a difference between a target and a legal guarantee. A legal guarantee is far more than a target. It's something that's enshrined in law, that people have the legal right to be seen within 12 weeks if they're an eligible inpatient. Now, that legal right has not been met. So, you are not fulfilling the will of Parliament. The boards are not implementing the will of Parliament. And patients across Scotland are not having their legal entitlement observed, guaranteed or implemented. Is it not a farce that you have a legal right and you can ignore that?
We're not ignoring it, Convener. I want to absolutely assure the committee we are not ignoring it. We are working towards it. I accept the points you make, but John Conaghan can tell you more about what we're doing to get ourselves into a better position on that. The Parliament also made certain its position clear on how they thought that legal guarantee ought to be implemented, and the redress that was available, we work within that. We seek to give the patients of Scotland confidence that we are working towards that, and we also, I would emphasise, are meeting that 12-week target in many, many cases. It's not that there's a shortfall in terms of tens of percentage points, but I make no claim that we're meeting it altogether at the present moment. No claim at all.
You say you're working within the redress. What is the redress if it's not met?
Ultimately, a patient could seek judicial review if they wished. The patient has access also to a means of raising their case with the board in question. But John will give you more detail on how we're working towards that and on the principles we're adopting.
Mr. Conley explains how you're working towards it. Can I just pursue that point of redress? So if you've got deep pockets, if you've got the money to go for judicial review, then you might just possibly have some success. But if you're poor, if you have limited resources, and you don't have either the knowledge, the confidence, or the financial wherewithal to go for judicial review, then tough. There's nothing that you can do. So the rich, the articulate, and the confident will be able to pursue some redress, and the rest of the country can just go whistle as far as redress is concerned.
No, Convener, I take your point, but I can only work within the legislation as it is presented in Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
I do not hold the view that the poor can go whistle. One of the things I have made absolutely clear since I have started in this job is that tackling the persistent health inequalities in Scotland is an absolute top priority for me, and I believe it ought to be for the NHS, and I believe it ought to be for the wider public sector. I accept the points you're making about the fact that we're not meeting the target. I would not accept that I believe that the poor can go whistle. Quite the opposite.
Okay, so if you're poor and living in fairly distressed circumstances and the guarantee is not met, what redress is there?
You're able to approach the board and seek confirmation that your case will be handled as quickly as possible. You could seek redress or access via your MSP. Or you would be able to go via your local councillor. These things are available.
No, the committee members are all MSPs. Now, I know, and each of my colleagues in the committee will have taken up cases with the Health Board. Now, I know the limitations of that. Firstly, you won't give us any information unless there are patient confidentiality forms signed, and that's perfectly understandable. So we've got, going through that authorisation process, and that can take time. We know that we can ask and inquire. We know that we cannot order you, because I can't write to you or to the Chief Executive of Health Board and say, here is the legal guarantee. I want you to implement that. We don't have that power. So, in a sense, you're putting another obstacle in the way of patients. Why should they have to come to me to get you to implement their legal right?
They shouldn't, Mr Henry. They shouldn't.
So what? You say that they can approach the board. What statistics do you have of the number of people who have complained about their legal rights not being met and have then had that legal right implemented?
Well, clearly, if they've not had their legal right, they'll already be over the 12 weeks.
Yes.
I don't have statistics. I will find out what there is, and I will be happy to present such statistics as we have to the committee. I would also want to stress to the committee that my priority is to get everyone within the 12 weeks. That is my priority.
I understand that, and I understand your personal commitment, and I know from the many tasks that you've carried out in the Scottish Government, where your passions lie and the work that you've done in relation, for example, to people living in poorer communities and tackling poverty and deprivation. I don't doubt that for a moment. What I'm asking is what happens if someone's legal right is not met? What is being done? It's not a target, it's not an aspiration, it's not a hope, it's not something that's a personal desire. It's a legal right that's not been met. What is being done? And if it's not immediately implemented, then what's the point of having a legal right when nothing can be done to achieve that legal right?
Well, as I said, we can only operate within the boundaries set by the legislation passed through Parliament. But if it was acceptable to you, Convener, I would ask John to give you some detail on what we're doing to make sure we get there.
Okay.
There is a duty on boards that if they cannot make an appointment for treatment within 12 weeks, then they have to offer the next available appointment. So I think we need to look at the general performance of the NHS in that respect. It's come a long way. The waiting list is now half what it was 10 years ago. We have 50,000 people currently on the waiting list. 10 years ago, we had 112,000 people on the waiting list. So we've come a long way. The NHS has set progressively tougher targets through Parliament. They're the toughest in the UK, and I don't see anywhere else in Europe that's operating to the same level. We can supply that data to you if you want. It's a recent study by the Office of National Statistics that I referred to in that respect. Now, where are we currently against the 12-week treatment time guarantee? Scotland is achieving 98.5% of that. Okay, so we have a 1.5% gap, if I can put that in context, Convener. It still should be, I do take the point seriously, that it should still be 100%. There are two boards that currently we are working with where the gap is a bit bigger. These are Lothian, and I think we have discussed at some length why Lothian is in this position, and they are currently in a recovery plan where they're investing greater than £20 million per annum to achieve a much better performance for the local patients. And the other one is Grampian, where they are again investing a similar amount to put some additional theatre capacity in. These things do take a bit of time. Grampian's theatres should be opened, the additional theatres that they're investing in should be opened shortly. So I think, again, if the committee were looking at this in a year's time, you would see a significant change in the overall cohort performance as we move from 98.5% towards eventual delivery of that 100% target.
I don't doubt for a moment that there's been huge progress in the NHS in Scotland, nor do I doubt the commitment and the dedication of staff. I think often they perform miracles, given the circumstances in which they work and the challenges that confront them. I think it's fantastic what is achieved, and it's something of which we can all be proud. And that's why I think right across the parties there is support for the NHS in Scotland. I suppose in a sense I'm maybe questioning the wisdom of Parliament in introducing legislation that has been ignored, that has not been met. Because it begins to question the sanity of politicians when they bring in laws that can be blithely ignored and are seen largely as targets. You can have targets or you can have laws, you can have guarantees. And if you have a law, then it should be implemented. Will the treatment time guarantee, will the legal guarantee be met 100% right across Scotland? And if so, when?
I think, Convener, we need to just think about the absolute delivery of that guarantee 100% all the time, when we might well have some perhaps unusual circumstances. Let me just give you an example. 12 weeks is pretty tight, but it's something that we've set our stall out to achieve. But if we, let's say, have a consultant who is due to treat a patient on Friday, within that 12 weeks, and the consultant is sick and no one else can do that, then we will automatically trip into a failure. Now, I can understand that in certain respects, because 100% means that we probably need to move that threshold back so that we've got a little bit of leeway, and we'll certainly want to do that and work with boards to achieve that over the course of the next couple of years. So at this stage, I don't think I would want to venture an absolute answer to you. But I think I would probably want to refer you to the plans that we've got that we currently have in place to try and achieve that on a sustainable basis, notwithstanding odd events like sickness, etc.
I actually understand your caution, and in a sense I understand your frustration, because you're saying to me that you cannot give 100% guarantee that the law will be implemented. Now, in a sense, that poses question about the stupidity of politicians making laws that cannot be implemented. That's not your problem, that's our problem. But we have a law now, and you're telling me that you cannot give that absolute guarantee that it will be implemented for everyone in Scotland?
Sorry, there's one distinction that I must clarify about what I said. I'm cautious about giving you that distinction today, or that guarantee today. Okay, I think I might be less cautious in the fullness of time in giving you that guarantee that it will be sustained in the future. So, as of today, I think I need to be a little bit cautious about saying exactly when we would deliver that.
But listen, leaving aside your caution, leaving aside the fullness of time, we have a law now. We have a law today. So, if we've got a law today, then people should be able to have their legal rights recognised. Now, I suspect from what you're saying is that the health service in Scotland is not in a position to give people that legal right, which then begs the question, what was the point of delivering that legal right that couldn't be delivered? I'll let Mr Gray in, and then I'll move on to other members.
Thank you, Convener. I'm not going to be drawn on the wisdom of Parliament. I am, however, I just want to say two things. Firstly, I don't wholly accept that we are ignoring the legal guarantee. We are working very hard to meet it, and I think it has put a useful signal both to the public and to the NHS about what the Parliament's expectations are. The second point I would make is that I don't think there would be any health service in the world who would guarantee that a consultant won't go off sick on a day when they're meant to perform an operation. I was fortunate enough, my daughter had an operation by a very distinguished orthopaedic consultant, and she's had a very successful recovery. But to be honest, I would rather have waited for him to do it, had it been necessary for me to do so. But you've been generous in your comments in relation to our own personal commitment and the commitment of the NHS, and I welcome that, Convener.
I don't doubt the wisdom of what you say. Any family, any parent would want to make sure that they waited and that it's it's done properly, rather than rush and botch things simply to meet a commitment. And you're right, no health service in the world can guarantee that a consultant, as you say, doesn't go off sick, which then makes me wonder why a health service in Scotland says, given the context of your words, why the health service in Scotland says you have that legal right, when you're telling me, and Mr Conaghan's telling me, that you actually cannot guarantee that someone won't go off and that the standard won't be met. It's just bizarre that we have this. Sorry, Mary Scanlon and then James Dornan.
I just want to echo the convener's comments about the National Health Service, and as we speak, my granddaughter is back in Aberdeen Royal and Sick Children's Hospital, and there's nobody more grateful to the work the NHS does than my family, my party, etc. I would like to pick up the convener's comments and also Mr Conaghan. Mr Conaghan, you said that 98% of people received their outpatient appointment within 12 weeks. Now, I'm looking at the update, Audit Scotland update for December, a month ago. And in actual fact, Mr Gray, you said several times to the convener that you're working towards your target. In actual fact, you're working further away from your target, because in September 2012, 5,993 people waited over 12 weeks, 5,993. In September 2013, that rose to 11,544. In fact, almost double the amount. It went up, an increase from 2.7% to 4.6%, and that's paragraph 16 in the December update. So how can you say you're working towards your target when almost double the amount of people have missed the 12-week target? And Mr Conaghan, how can you say 98% of people received their outpatient appointment within 12 weeks when it's gone up from 2.7 to 4.6?
Clarify that, Convener, if I could. My reference to 98.5% was in relation to inpatients rather than outpatients. I think I also referred to 95.4% in relation to outpatients. So I think, let me just clarify that one was inpatients and the other one was outpatients.
Do you agree that you're actually further away from your target? I mean, every outpatient, well, many outpatients become inpatients, so the longer they have to wait, the more detrimental it is. Do you agree with the figures that are here in the Audit Scotland report, paragraph 16, that twice as many people have missed the target September 2013 compared to September 2012?
Yes, I do for outpatients. That is, I recognise the IST publication for that. That's an accurate representation.
So would you say that working towards the target is also an inaccurate representation of where you are at the moment?
I wouldn't agree with that, Convener. And why wouldn't I agree with that? Because I know from the plans that boards have laid that they have increased staff. They have this year, I think, a total investment plan to address that issue of over £67 million, albeit that's across all NHS boards. Not just Grampian and not just Lothian that I referred to previously. So we are seriously working towards it. It's part of the performance management regime that we have. I discuss progress on that with boards regularly. But I do recognise the figure that you quote. I think it's Exhibit 1 in the Audit Scotland report of December 2013.
Yeah. I do welcome the plans for the future, but I welcome that very much. But our task is to look at the Audit Scotland reports that are presented to this Parliament.
Can I add one more brief thing of comment? And it's just about activity. I'm just looking at some of the statistics this morning. The NHS actually is doing quite a lot more, and it's doing more in the past few years. So, you know, if I take a look at the position from 2009 to now, the NHS is seeing about 9% more outpatients now than it was seeing then. So, working towards means that we actually are indeed doing more activity. The question is, how far further do we need to push that envelope? What more do we need in the way of resources to address that demand? But can I put the statistic that you've quoted on outpatients and that 95.4% figure in some context? We do 4 million outpatients per annum. The rise in the waiting list and the deterioration in that performance represents a very tiny proportion of that 4 million that we see. It's about 2% of total of new outpatients. So I'd just like to put that in perspective in terms of the entire performance of the NHS, which sees many millions of patients.
Yes. Well, we're looking at the targets that have been set, which is our duty to do. Can I also refer you to page 9? Get a wee bit confused about this. The footnotes. In January 2012, the 18-week referral to treatment became a standard rather than a target. And in April 2011, the 12-week wait for a new patient appointment became a standard rather than a target.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a standard and a target?
That's a very good question. I can understand.
I'm looking for a very good answer.
I hope so. I hope so, Convener. I can understand the confusion between a standard and a target, and I won't pretend that the use of that terminology is anything but easy. I would say to the committee that we are this year embarking on a little bit of a review of our entire heat standard setup. Okay, and I would hope that when we next attend, I would be able to have something that's simpler to explain to you. But let me just explain why a standard becomes a standard. over the past few years, we have generally had anywhere between about 20 to 30 heat targets on an annual basis for the NHS to pursue. Some of these have got a predetermined time limit, so we need to achieve X by Y date. Ministers take the decision sometimes to maintain these as something that should always be achieved by the NHS. And they distinguish that from new heat targets by calling legacy targets standards. Those are things that need to be maintained. So, for example, let me pick one that's clinically relevant that Dr. Keel here would recognise, which is the target we had on patients being treated within a certain time period for hip fracture. Okay? We achieved that back in 2008-9, but we decided that's such an important target that we will not let it slip. We won't forget about it. So that then became a standard that we had expected the NHS to always maintain thereafter. I know it's a little bit confusing, but we are in the process, as I say, of just trying to unclutter that, and we can write to the committee in due course about that.
Sorry, forgive me, Mr Conahan, maybe not the sharpest tool in the block, but I still don't understand the difference between a standard and a target.
Right,
I mean, the explanation in footnote 5 on page 9 of the report to which Ms Scanlon referred is given by Audit Scotland. Standards are used for targets that are past the target date but are maintained to monitor progress or for other purposes such as benchmarking. So in other words, a target is something broadly that we're aspiring to meet and working towards, and a standard is something that we want to maintain. That's about as simple as I can give it.
So when you don't meet the target, it becomes a standard?
No. No. We want
Standards
to
are used for targets that are past the target date.
So in other words, if a target has been met, we could drop that target and say, right, we've met that target, so we'll just drop it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we could say, no, that is, as Mr Conahan has said, that is a target of sufficient importance that although we have met it, we want to continue to meet it, and therefore it becomes a standard.
Standards are used for targets that are past the target date, but are maintained to monitor progress.
Yes. So once the target date...
So once it's past the target, once you haven't met the target date, once it's past the target date, you call it a standard.
No. Once the target... So if we say that by... Just in the abstract, if we had said that by June 2012 we would achieve a certain target, having achieved that target, we say that is a target that is important to the health service in Scotland, and therefore we will now, instead of saying that target is gone, we will say we will maintain that as a standard. So having achieved it, we will maintain it. That is the principle.
Oh, right, okay. Can I just refer to the point the convener made about, sanctions and the legal right. What I haven't heard anywhere in this argument is the legal right that people in Scotland, as part of member state of the European Union, have a legal right to go to any country in Europe should the target or standard for inpatient surgery, etc., not be met. Are patients in Scotland offered the cross-border health care that they are entitled to when target or standards aren't met?
Yes, they are, and indeed I met with my opposite numbers from England and Wales and Northern Ireland on Thursday and Friday of last week, and that was one of the issues we discussed, actually seeking to simplify that in terms of cross-border charging. I'm sure John Matheson and John Conahan can give you more detail, but the simple answer to your question is yes, that is offered, and indeed it is taken up.
Right, okay. Can I just go on to a point in the report? Vacancy rates have increased, NHS boards temporarily not filling posts to make savings or redesign services, difficulties attracting staff, higher vacancy rates, more spent on agency, bank nurses and the private sector. Now, within the report, the Audit Scotland did say, the standard against the outpatient has been deteriorating, as we've been saying. But the report pointed to difficulties within the health service that would make it very difficult both now and in the future to meet these targets. Do you acknowledge that these difficulties are there, and that that Audit Scotland highlighted, and that these targets will be more difficult to achieve in future?
John Conaghan will say more on the workforce issues in a second. I think the broad outline I would give Ms Scanlon is to say that the staffing numbers in the NHS broadly have risen slightly, not substantially, but they have risen slightly. But the demographic trends that we face in Scotland, as the rest of the world faces, mean that there is additional pressure. John Conaghan has already alluded to the increase in outpatient presentations over time. I don't think that the situation on staffing makes it impossible to meet the targets that we have set ourselves. I believe that we're working closely with the boards through their workforce planning to ensure that we have the right resources in the right place at the right time. But I'm not going to say that there is never a case when it is difficult to recruit. That would be wrong of me to say so.
But if staffing levels have increased, but it's taking longer to fill vacancies, and money is being saved through vacancy management, you know, the longer vacancies take to be filled, that could actually counter the small increase in staffing.
If there wasn't proper workforce management, that would be so. Yes. I believe that, generally speaking, the boards do have good and robust workforce management processes and strategies in place. But John can give you more detail on where we've come on the specifics.
I think it's a very valid point that you raise about the length of time that a vacancy is advertised. So we do scrutinise boards in that respect. We look at vacancies that have been advertised for less than 3 months and those that are advertised for more than 3 months. I don't have the statistics to hand for that, but I'm happy to supply them to the committee. But what I do have to hand is the general staffing statistics, and particularly the ones for medical staff. So since 2006, we now have in medical consultants an increase of nearly 1,000. That's a 28% increase in staffing. So when we look at the number of vacancies that are advertised, I would ask you to do so against the background of increased staffing over that period, because new posts have been created. But in fact, when I also look in the same time period of vacancies as a percentage of establishment, September 2006 we had 7% of vacancies for consultants unfilled, and as at September 13 we had 4.4% of vacancies unfilled. So I wouldn't necessarily agree that we have got an increase in vacancies. It depends what time period you look at it, and it also depends on when boards advertise newly created posts.
There was also a significant increase in agency staff and a 5-fold increase in the private sector. But I know the convener's looking at me, so I'll just look ask very briefly about paragraph 52, and it's the gaps in the inpatient information currently submitted to ISD. And obviously this committee, we're always looking for accurate information, but it includes patient-level data broken down by specialities, patients removed from waiting lists, the reasons, etc. I don't want to read them all out, but there are 5 separate categories that Audit Scotland report says there are gaps in inpatient information. Can I just ask when you would expect to be able to provide this information to ISD in order to get the accuracy that this committee looks for?
With your permission, I'll answer that one. This information set is as a result of the extensive audit that was carried out, where many millions of patient records were scrutinised over the course of the last year and a half, both by internal audit and by Audit Scotland. So a series of recommendations about how we could improve accuracy were put to the NHS over a year ago. The NHS has been working hard to make sure that all of the IT and data systems that we have, data collection systems, are up to speed. I'm happy to say to the committee that we, in this quarter here, are starting to gather that, all that information as the first cut of information. The next quarter, which starts 1st of April through to June, we should have a complete data set in that new format for the whole of Scotland. I think it will take 1 or 2 quarters thereafter to make sure that we have ironed out all of the bumps in terms of that data collection. But again, I think if we were looking at this in a year's time, we would be able to report that we have fulfilled that requirement 100%.
So in April this year, we will be able to get more accurate information about waiting times?
From April this year, you will be able to get much more accurate information, bearing in mind that the data for that April to June period will be published, I think, about 8 weeks after that period end.
Thank you.
Okay.
James Dornan and then Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Navina. I'll just briefly go back to the legal guarantees, if you don't mind. I don't think there's any law that you can 100% guarantee that you can implement 100% of the time, so I think it would be unrealistic for us to think that we should be doing that with this. But is there a case that even if, as the convener has said, we're not in a position where people can get this legal guarantee, is there a case that there's been spin-off benefits from it? I mean, you talked about, for example, that after the 12-week, there's a responsibility on the first available appointment.
Well, I think that's a very good point. What are the spin-off benefits? Boards are now absolutely focused on making sure that performance of for that cohort of patients is as absolutely tight as we can possibly make it. An example of one of the spin-off benefits is the significant drop that we've seen, for example, in the median wait. Yeah? 122 days for a median wait for a hip replacement in 2006-07 compared to 2012-13, which is 67, best in the UK. So that's much tighter. The other spin-off benefit is that it forces boards to seriously reconsider their capacity and demand, and we can see that reflected in the 67 million that I quoted earlier about the additional resources going in to support the delivery of that on a 100% basis. The reason I was cautious previously about giving an absolute date is that involves recruitment, it involves building, it involves expanded capacity, and we need to fling that against the increase in demand that I've previously referred to the committee. So enormous spin-off benefits, I think, have accrued to that. And I think I've demonstrated that by reference to some of the recent statistics.
Okay, I'd like to go on to another point. In evidence to the Health and Sport Committee in October 2013, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing indicated the Scottish Government was looking at ways to increase flexibility in the current system. What action is the Scottish Government taking in response to the Auditor General's recommendation that it should consider moving away from the current system of annual financial targets, and what options have been identified for introducing increased flexibility into the current system, and how the arrangements would work in practice?
Thank you, Mr. Donnan. I'll ask John Matheson to comment in detail on that. I think we're already engaging in 5-year forward financial planning with the boards, but I recognise the point that Audit Scotland are making about the annuality of expenditure. Of course, we are working within Treasury rules on some of that, but John Matheson will be able to give you detail, which he and I discussed last night, about the precise steps that we're taking to provide greater flexibility to boards, which we do believe to be increasingly important.
Thank you for the question. I think 3 or 4 points in respect of that. First of all, I totally agree with Audit Scotland that an annual approach to financial planning is not the best approach. There's something artificial about trying to land a particular financial situation at the 31st of March each year. And an over-focus on that leads to a propensity for short-termism in terms of financial planning. And that's why we take exactly the opposite approach. So we have to recognise, as Mr Gray has said, that we have a requirement under HM Treasury to deliver a particular financial position by statute at the end of the financial year. But having taken that as a given, We do look to work with boards in developing financial plans that take a much broader horizon. So the financial planning as a norm with boards is in the 3 to 5 year spectrum. So we expect that. Boards who have significant financial capital investment, we look for a 10-year position in terms of their profile in respect of that. We do try and recognise and assist boards in terms of using brokerage and banking around the financial year end. So, for example, in this current financial year, we have had money returned to us from Dumfries and Galloway Health Board and from Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. Now, the reason why they've done that is they are preparing for the double running costs that they both will be facing in terms of the development of Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary in 2 to 3 years' time, and the opening of the Southern Glasgow investment, £842 million of capital investment on that site, which will take place in just over a year's time. So that's good examples of these boards taking a long-term perspective and recognising double running costs going forward. The Scottish Government has access to the budget exchange mechanism, and we're in active discussions with colleagues in Scottish Government about whether an element of that could be applicable to the health budget to give us some additional flexibility in respect of that. There's other points I could make, but I'm conscious of time convenience, so I'll just stop there.
Can I ask, just for clarification then, I mean, clearly there's some restrictions, HM restrictions on you. Are you saying that you're using other methods to try, I mean, the board still have a responsibility, is that right, to do their annual accounts?
Yes.
But what you're doing is you're trying to find other ways to sort of finance that so that they can look forward to a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, etc.
Absolutely that. Whilst recognising the statutory requirement to live within your financial resources in any financial year, we're trying to use legitimate approaches to maximise the flexibility whilst acknowledging that absolute requirement.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask Mr Gray or colleagues, the use of social unavailability codes increased dramatically between 2008 and 11 and then fell from 36% to 18% over the next 2 years. Do you know why that happened?
I can pick that up.
John can pick that up. I'll give you a very brief answer, Mr McIntosh. It shows the benefit of this committee and others paying close attention to things. Would be a part of my answer.
Could you expand on that?
Well, I think if something is the subject of public scrutiny, I think transparency in the NHS makes sense. And I think that public scrutiny means that we get better. I think it's an important part of the function of any Parliament to provide that scrutiny, and the availability of that scrutiny, uncomfortable though it may be for people like me at times, actually means that we get better. That's my broad answer to your question, but John Conaghan's well placed on the specifics.
So just before John Conaghan comes in the specifics, does that mean that had there not been that scrutiny, then NHS Lothian would still have been manipulating the figures?
No, it doesn't, Mr Henry, because the Chief Executive of the NHS at the time, Derek Feely, put in place procedures to consider what was going on in NHS Lothian based on information that he had, and I know that because I was part of the team that went in to conduct and to provide support. But what I am acknowledging is the benefit of a committee such as this providing public scrutiny, which in turn brings into public view the circumstances of the NHS in general and other parts of the public sector. I think it's beneficial.
Mr Conaghan?
Yeah, this has been the subject of much debate in previous committee meetings. I can remember looking at the February 2013 reports from Audit Scotland. Two, I think, main reasons why unavailability fell. If we take a look at the peak of unavailability, it was in late September 2010. We saw a big spike there for inpatients and day cases and indeed outpatients. Much of it occasioned in that unusual spike through the bad winter of 2010. Early in 2011, I agreed with most NHS boards an investment package, some of it short-term and non-recurring, to address that spike in unavailability, because if patients couldn't get to their appointment through no fault of their own, or if staff couldn't get into hospital because they just couldn't make the travel arrangements, nonetheless we had a responsibility to try and redress that. So actually, about a year or so before Lothian came to the attention of this committee, unavailability began to fall, and that was a piece of evidence that was submitted not just by Mr Feely but by a number of chief executives that sat around this table as well, from what I recall.
Are you suggesting that the whistleblowing in NHS Lothian had nothing to do with this?
I can remember exactly what happened with NHS Lothian because I was the whistleblower. It was my letter of the 6th of January 2012 to NHS Lothian that indicated dissatisfaction with their first report to their board, because I didn't think it was extensive enough. And it was me that requested NHS Lothian to then ask their internal audit, who were independent, to take a look at this in closer detail. That report was made public, I think, in March 2012. So actually, I was the whistleblower.
Interesting take on events. The way that we engaged with the Auditor General last week, she was very clear that much as this committee had a key role because of the whistleblowing, that she could not use audit to reveal why unavailability codes were going up. And she said there was a direct correlation between the whistleblowing in NHS Lothian and then the decline in the use of availability codes. And it was not because the audit was able to identify those.
I merely just pointed to page 20, Exhibit 6 of the Auditor General's report of February 2013, and asked you to take a look at the timescales for that, where I can quite clearly see that inpatient and day case unavailability peaked at about 40%, and by the time 2012 came along, a year later, and that was the time that Lothian surfaced, it was 25%.
And you're saying it's nothing to do with the whistleblowing in NHS Lothian?
I think there's been a much greater focus thereafter. Unavailability percentage dropped from about 25% down to about 20% in the following year. So I think, as Mr Gray has said, undoubtedly the focus on unavailability during that time period has had an impact. But I just
the point I'm making, I mean, it's quite clear that the NHS has got in an absolute panic over the misuse of unavailability codes. The trouble is that one board was found out not through public audit, but through the work of a whistleblower. It wasn't through the work of scrutiny. Scrutiny then turned on the work of the whistleblower, and all the other NHS boards got in a panic, and you've put the resources in since. But I mean, surely you must admit that it was the whistleblower that blew this in the first place.
No, I can quite clearly remember the events of that autumn, which was late 2011 and early 2012. It was the investigation that we asked NHS Lothian to carry out at that stage. That
at this point, the whistleblowing had already happened, though.
I can't recall any whistleblower asking about the use of social unavailability codes. What I can recall, though, is a case that appeared in late 2011 where somebody had refused to go to England for treatment and complained about that, and that's what surfaced at that stage. But I think the thing you're referring to, which is about the use of social unavailability codes, was only uncovered through the detailed audit that we requested the NHS Lothian to undertake as part of that programme from the early part of 2011 onwards.
I think it's interesting the way you put this. I think after public anxiety was already expressed. Can I just read you Carolyn Gardner's quote from the committee last time? I asked her, you highlight the fact that the use of unavailability codes began to fall at the same time as NHS Lothian was identified as abusing the system. And she said, there is definitely a correlation. It is worth being clear about the fact that we, that's the Auditor General, did not identify that in Lothian. It was identified, as the committee highlighted at the time, as a result of whistleblowing in Lothian. The same trend was apparent in the use of unavailability codes across other health boards, but despite extensive audit work on our part, the audit trail simply was not strong enough to explain why that happened elsewhere. What do you make of that remark?
I think I can recognise that remark in the sense that the detailed patient information, which is now going to be available, that Ms Scanlon has referred to, will be available from this April onwards. At that time, we had what was called an aggregate return, which is all the patients. So it was impossible for either Audit Scotland or indeed a local NHS board to drill down for the individual application of social unavailability for each individual patient. Now we have a system. Since then, and I think this goes back to the remarks that Mr Gray has said, with the scrutiny and focus of this committee, means that any patient needs to, if there is a period of unavailability being applied, agree to that and have that explained in writing to them. So I think scrutiny has helped, and that scrutiny came in 2012.
Okay. I mean, just to be clear, I am pleased that clearly you are concerned about the use and the misuse of these codes to disguise how long people are waiting for operations and urgent care in the NHS. I'm slightly concerned, though, that the audit trail was not available to this Parliament, so that we did not come across it through audit. And I'm concerned about the use of gagging and confidentiality clauses. Between 2000 and I think it's 2007-2013, there were 697 compromise agreements. Do you know how many of them included confidentiality or gagging clauses in the NHS?
I don't, Mr McIntosh, and I think these, as my understanding is that the information on that would be held at board level. So I mean, just be simple, I don't know the answer to your question.
My understanding is that, and this is from a letter to the committee, that every one of those in NHS Lothian included a gagging clause inserted by the Central Legal Office. Do you think that most of them or all of them have gagging clauses?
On the basis that I don't know, I think I would be safer to say I don't know.
What's your policy about the use of confidential agreements from now on in the NHS?
The policy on the use of confidentiality agreements is actually a matter that I and other officials are currently in discussion with the Cabinet Secretary about, and I'm sure once the Cabinet Secretary has reached a view, we'd be happy to let the committee know about that. I wouldn't like to preempt the Cabinet Secretary's decision on the matter.
So do you support whistleblowing or not?
I support ministers, Mr McIntosh. I support whistleblowing as a principle, but in terms of what my advice to ministers would be, then clearly that's a matter that I would obviously keep in private.
You support it as a principle, but you don't mind the fact that NHS Lothian have gagging clauses in every single one of their compromise agreements?
I think you would be drawing me too far to say what I mind and don't mind. What I mind and don't mind personally is not a basis on which policy is made.
Okay, you're in charge of the NHS in Scotland. Do you think there should be gagging clauses in all these compromise agreements?
It's a matter that I'm discussing with the Cabinet Secretary, and I'd prefer to wait until the Cabinet Secretary has reached his view on that policy before describing to the committee what the position is.
Do you think it's a concern that the only reason that the use of unavailability codes in the NHS has declined is because of whistleblowing, and yet we are inserting gagging clauses in all our compromise agreements? Do you think that's a matter of some concern?
I don't think that the only reason that the use of social unavailability codes has declined is as you describe. I mean, Mr Connaughton has given, I think, a good account, and I can vouch for it, of work that he undertook before the NHS Lothian matter came to the surface. I've acknowledged, however, the benefit of public scrutiny. I'm not sure about the link you're making. Genuinely, I'm not saying that just to deflect the question. I'm not quite sure about the link you're making between gagging clauses and social unavailability codes.
It might be. It might also be worth just adding very briefly that we do have a national confidential alert line, which was set up to receive calls from concerned members of staff if there were any issues that they wish to highlight. That's currently in pilot phase. It's been running for about 9 months or so just now. We will be evaluating that between now and the end of this financial year to determine its future. But that gives us, I think, another arm to this, that we do take whistleblowing seriously.
If I may just summarise, before I finish, let me just summarise. It is of great concern that one of the biggest scandals is at the NHS in the last few years, which is the use of unavailability codes to disguise waiting lists in the NHS in Scotland, was only revealed not through the work of audit trails, but through the work of whistleblowing. And it's therefore of great concern to me, if not to else, that we actually promote a culture of secrecy rather than transparency through the overuse and the misuse of gagging clauses in the NHS. If every single compromise settlement with staff in the NHS includes a gagging clause, that is not a culture of transparency. And yet, Mr Gray, you are saying you support a culture of transparency.
And I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr McIntosh, to reiterate that. I do support a culture of transparency. I'm simply, I think, properly not at this stage in a position to say what my advice to the Cabinet Secretary would be, nor his response to that advice. But I am willing to commit to ensure that the committee is aware as quickly as possible of the position on confidentiality agreements once the Cabinet Secretary has reached a view.
Can I just clarify before we move on that in terms of discussion about whistleblowing and Lothian, I think Mr Connan, you said on at least 2 occasions that you were that whistleblower.
Yes. I'm referring to the events that took place in the early part of 2012. If the committee remembers, we had asked NHS Lothian to look into why there were retrospective adjustments in one department in Lothian to waiting list information. That report was furnished to Lothian's NHS board, and I think it was discussed in the December 2011 board meeting. Having reflected on that, I thought there was more that needed to be done. Sure. We could easily have accepted that report and said, well, that's fine. But over that Christmas and New Year period, I took a decision with my Director of Performance hat on to say I needed to look at it in a bit more detail. And it was only after that that the stuff on unavailability came out.
I appreciate it. I just wanted to make sure that that was put on record, that when there was the discussion about unavailability codes and whistleblowing in Lothian, that any reference to whistleblowing, it's actually you that had started that process. So
I'm happy to supply my letter of the 6th of January 2012 to the committee.
We can reflect on whether that's needed. Thanks very much. Colin Beattie and Miller Coffey.
Statistics are fine, but it's what you do with them that counts. Obviously, one of the most important aspects of statistics coming forward is to enable planning and reaction. Reaction, obviously, to pressure as it arises any place in the system. That can happen at any time, either through some winter bug or whatever is going to affect one or the other hospitals. How do you monitor that? How do you react to it? What sort of support do you give to individual elements of the NHS as and when they need that? How long is the delay before it hits your desk?
Well, John Conaghan will give you the detail on our performance management arrangements to the extent that the committee requires it. But I think one thing I would say is that we are not, although we have to be bound in terms of public statements by the official publication of statistics, and we respect that. We do not wait until official statistics are published before we take any action that may be required. So John Conaghan and his team of performance managers receive regular updates from boards. They're monitored on a monthly basis. We meet with the board chairs and chief executives monthly and put before them the latest information we have in a collective setting, but also in an individual setting. As I say, there's regular performance management. So my point, Mr Beattie, is I wouldn't like to leave the committee with the impression that we wait until official statistics come out and then decide what to do about it. Our approach is more proactive than that, and John will be able to sketch in.
I think I have very little to add to that, convener. If I can maybe draw the committee's attention to the annual report from one of my teams. It's called Quest, and it's reporting on the quality and efficiency support team. There are over 30 or so case studies for each territorial and special board there about the interventions that we've had to improve things across the NHS. So I think Mr Gray has outlined what we do in process, but we also report on that in public.
But if there is pressure at a certain point, what do you do? Do you provide resources? Do you provide advice? How do you work with that particular area?
I suppose it's, I need to use the term tailored support, because not all issues are issues where additional resources are required. And I think our ambition in recent years, and as Mr Matheson might describe if asked, has been to maximise the amount that Scottish Government gives at the start of each financial year, so that boards know what they've got and have got good planning. But if there's a particular issue which arises where a board has got some service pressure, then we do look to see what we can do to supply expert help. And this is all about spreading good practice. So if, for example, a board is running into difficulty, let's say with a particular issue around cancer, or if it's got a particular issue in terms of recruitment, we look to see what else has worked in Scotland, and we promote innovation and the spread of good practice. And we have got excellent and frequent communication points with boards to make that happen.
How promptly, how quickly do you think you get advised of these pressure points? We do a risk assessment each year of board annual plans. We call these local delivery plans, and each board gives us an idea of how they're setting their stall out for the future year. You would call it a business plan. Now that gives us an idea of where perhaps some of the greatest risks are. I made some reference earlier to the fact that we gather management statistics. So for some key indicators, for example, accident emergency statistics, I gather these from a management perspective weekly. So I can track weekly, and so do boards, okay? Track weekly how they're doing on that key statistic. If a board is in trouble, then we actually gather that set of statistics on a daily basis. Now that's not as overly bureaucratic as you might think. But nonetheless, it gives us an immediate hint as to why there is a pressure. And if you were to ask, let's say, a clinical director and a local manager of one of our big hospitals, how often they take a look at pressures in the system and how they react to them, then I think you would see, an answer coming through that is on a daily basis. I would suggest that you visit Fife as an example. I was there last week to take a look at what they had as a discharge hub, and I attended their daily meeting to take a look at the pressures in the hospital and how they were balancing out staff versus activity. So it's pretty immediate.
Mr. Beattie, could I just briefly come in, if I may, for just 2 or 3 points from a financial perspective? So how do we try and assist boards? And it links back to Mr. Dornan's comments about the long-term planning. So we try and give boards indicative budgets going forward. So as well as, say, 14-15, we've given boards indicative budgets for 15-16. And that is assisting them in terms of long-term financial planning. We give them and work with them in developing planning assumptions around future pay awards and the other pressures. So again, they're able to accommodate that within their planning assumptions. We try and give them the majority of their allocations as early as possible in the financial year. So by the end of July, boards will have received 96% of their allocations for the year. We try and reduce the level of micromanagement in terms of giving them budgets for individual policy areas. So we try and bundle allocations around common themes, such as health promotion and healthy intervention. There's a number of themes within that. So with the bundles amount to about £250 million per annum. So that's us still leaving the boards with and again we're going back to targets, with a target to achieve which is outcome and output focused, but it's not micromanaging how they actually deliver those targets. And the final point I would make is we also have a review process with the boards. We have the formal annual review with the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister, but we also have mid-year reviews that John Connican and I carry out with boards, where we look at their in-year performance, not just in a financial perspective, but against the clinical performance targets and activity performance targets. And we also look forward in terms of what their efficiency plans are for future years. The brokerage, which we have given to a number of boards, and I referred to earlier in response to Mr Dornan's comments, is not given lightly. And brokerage is only given where we have reassurance that there is a short-term issue that boards need support with, and that they have a sustainable long-term plan going forward. And brokerage is only given predicated on that reassurance.
What I hear from you is planning, risk assessment and so on. But by the very nature of this service, there's going to be a crisis at one or other hospitals at any time because of some local issue or whatever. I don't know, flu, some sort of bug. How promptly do you put support in there? How do you put that support in? What's your contingency plans?
I think I made reference to the fact that you will find in most of our major hospitals a daily morning meeting to assess what the pressures are in the system. Are they experiencing rather more accident emergency referrals? Do they have somebody who's off sick, etc.? So you will find daily planning. And most boards have got, in fact all boards have got very good contingency arrangements that swing into place if they have got a particular service pressure in a particular department. They rebalance the resources to ensure that the service is maintained. And I refer you again to the annual report from the Quality and Efficiency Support Team. There are some excellent examples that might illustrate in detail, I think, the point that you're making.
Okay. Thank you. Willie Coffey.
Thanks, Convener, and my apologies, I need to leave at about 12:30. I only have two questions for the guests who've come today, one in each aspect of the reports we're looking at. The first one on the financial performance report by Audit Scotland. In the Auditor General's key messages, she clearly highlighted the successes in NHS boards across Scotland in meeting their financial targets and the savings that they're making, and she also made reference to the improved outcomes in Scotland for survival rates for heart disease, strokes and cancer. My colleague James Dornan asked about the annual financial planning arrangement, and Mr Matheson, I think, answered that, but I wonder if I could add to that. Is there any further scope for us to make improvements in relation to things like NHS capital assets, like property, things like drugs coming off patent, further savings to be made there, and something that's not in the Auditor General's report? I know there are substantial funds always set aside for things like medical negligence payouts, which unfortunately are required, I know that, but there's a substantial sums of money in that category that I know isn't deployed on an annual basis. So I suppose what I'm looking for, is there further scope that we could possibly look to assist our NHS boards to plan for that 5-year and 10-year long-term plan that the Auditor General referred to?
Yep. Thank you for the question. There's a number of points in there, and I will try and cover them all. But if I miss anything, please don't hesitate to come back to me. So in terms of the capital infrastructure is essential, but the capital infrastructure is there to deliver the strategic direction of NHS Scotland. So it's important that the buildings are identified, located, etc., to ensure that they support the delivery of the quality strategy, which is the overarching strategy that we have within NHS Scotland. We have a very significant capital programme going forward. We have, as I mentioned, the South Glasgow development, £842 million. We've got a number of specific projects going through the non-profit distributing route, such as the Sick Children's in Edinburgh, the replacement of Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary, Ayrshire and Arden Community Hospital, Balfour up in Kirkwall, and the Blood Transfusion Service. So there is a very significant reinvestment programme taking place. We're also conscious of the primary care dynamic, and just to highlight that we have a specific capital funding mechanism that will take forward some very innovative community projects. The Aberdeen Health Village has just been completed and just been handed over. There's developments taking place in Tane and Highland and Forest and Woodside back in Grampian. So there's a lot happening in that. And the aim of Hub is to look at how we can use our capital investment, not just within the health element of the public sector, but across both health and local government, and indeed into police and fire as well, and how we can use that. Backlog maintenance has been previously referred to by this committee and by the Health and Sport Committee. We recognise that we have significant backlog maintenance identified. we are very focused on prioritising the high-risk elements of backlog maintenance, and that has reduced by 60% over the last couple of years. Some of the residual backlog maintenance will be removed as we move out of the existing premises, such as sick children, such as Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary. So that's on the capital side. In terms of clinical negligence, our performance on clinical negligence in terms of costs compares very favourably with England. And the current expenditure for 13-14 will be around £34 million. So it's still, even to a finance director, a very significant sum of money. And what I've been working with the legal colleagues is to try and deal with clinical negligence claims where our liability is accepted. So we have done something wrong. We have harmed a patient. So we have accepted that. And it's trying to recognise that and recognise the cost of that in as fair a way as possible. Now, previously, the mechanism for doing that was to give out a lump sum, so a one-off payment. The disadvantage of that, and you get into tragic circumstances here, the disadvantage of that is if the life expectancy actually turned out to be longer than was anticipated at the time of settlement, then the funding stream is inadequate. And sadly, if the reverse was the case, then there was financial gain, which is the last thing anybody wanted. So what I've moved to now and got agreement from lawyers on this is that we will make a reduced lump sum payment to deal with the housing adaptations, to deal with transport, etc. And then we will make an annual payment for the duration of the life of the individual. And that has been welcomed by legal colleagues and is now taking place. It's called a PPO is the acronym, but that has been welcomed by legal colleagues. So there are some significant areas of pressure. On the capital side, I'll give you an example. We need to look at the capital asset, not just within individual health board areas, but also more of a regional basis. For example, the new laboratory infrastructure that's in place and being used within the South Glasgow development, which operates on a racetrack system, has got the potential to serve beyond Greater Glasgow and Clyde. So we need to make sure that the assets we have are appropriate, are located appropriately, but also are being used effectively. And the final point I would make on that, we need to ensure, and it's sometimes difficult in a less than buoyant housing market, that if we have surplus assets, that we dispose of them in a cost-effective way, so we get value for money, but we dispose of them in as timious a way as possible.
Just briefly following the answer you gave there, the figure of £34 million, but as I understand it, the set-aside amounts for things like medical negligence are far, far in excess of that are set aside and held within NHS Scotland. I just wonder if you could comment on that at all.
Certainly. The previous budget that NHS Scotland had for clinical negligence claims going back 3 or 4 years was £50 million. So the actual current level of settlements is actually reduced over the period. I personally get involved directly in some of the high-value claims and get involved in the detail of the negotiations. And the PPO approach has also helped in terms of reducing that.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was really on back to the waiting times issue. And I think, Mr Conahan, you gave a number of figures. Two is there 95.4% and 98.5%. I can't remember which was which. But was that in relation to the 12-week treatment time guarantee?
12-week treatment time guarantee is 90. As the inpatient one is 98.5%. I can clarify that in writing if you want. And the outpatient one was 95.4%.
Okay, but looking and taking that in the round, I mean, 98, let's say, percent of people we are meeting that target. We recognise we're not meeting the 100%. But what I'm interested in is for those who do not get the 12-week guarantee, when do they get it? Is there data that tells us, was it week 13 or is it further along that? Because that's clearly of importance to them as patients.
Yes, that data is available. We can request that data.
Close to this.
I don't have that data with me, but we regularly scrutinise that. There is a duty on NHS boards to slot patients into the next available appointment that's suitable for them. Complicated perhaps a bit because by the time you're reaching, let's say, 12 weeks, you will not have been classified as an urgent case. And most urgent cases are seen and never get on a waiting list at all. Most patients in Scotland, in fact, are seen within the first 2, 3, 4 weeks. So for a routine case, it's perhaps complicated by the fact that by the time they're slotted in, let's say in week 13, 14, I might say I'm unavailable for that, can I have a little bit more notice? But we do monitor that, and as I say, I don't have the statistics here, but there is a duty on NHS boards to slot them into the next available appointment.
I'm keen because of the discussion that was taking place about the specific target and the percentages and the time slot and the calamity thereafter if we don't actually match that. I'd like to know from a patient perspective just what their experience is in and around that target and how soon they are seen beyond the target.
I think, Mr Thorpe, Convener, if you wish, we should write to the committee on that subject. I think it would help to clarify the matter.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I, just before Mr Matheson, can I ask about that issue of medical negligence? Do you insure against that, or do you, in effect, self-insure?
We self-insure through budget provision within the health boards.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. Colin Keir?
Thanks, Convener. My question's really going back to the point made earlier about the rather significant rises in consultants over the last number of years, and I'm just trying to sort of fathom out, have you identified in any particular areas of concern where you've not been able to recruit, and is this something that is, if there is such a group of people who you're trying to recruit, is this something that is just unique to our area, or is it UK-wide, or is it Europe-wide, or whatever?
So I can give you 2 examples, perhaps, where it's where we have increased the number of consultants, but we still find it difficult to recruit. And sometimes this is down to the nature of the job. So, for example, recruiting to an emergency medicine post as part of the rota in an accident emergency department will prove more difficult, perhaps, than recruiting to, let's say, an orthopaedic surgeon post, because of the nature of the rota for 24/7 working that's required to staff on a continuous basis an accident emergency department. So it very much depends on the nature of the consultant vacancy. We're not unique in that sense. This is a phenomenon which is throughout the UK. And that's perhaps the best example I can give you of where we have got issues. But we do try to make jobs as attractive as we can in Scotland. We do try to link jobs between teaching boards and non-teaching boards, so that clinicians have got the ability to undertake research, which is attractive to them. And Dr. Keel perhaps is maybe better placed than me to maybe make a comment or two about how we recruit.
Happy to do that. As Mr. Connolly has said, there are certain specialty areas that are more difficult to recruit to than others. Pressure points, emergency medicine being one. Another is cancer specialists, particularly radiotherapy consultants, where there's a worldwide shortage, not just a UK shortage. And that manifested itself recently in the north of Scotland, where NHS Grampian faced a number of vacancies. So we've been working very closely with them to manage that process, which unfortunately in the short term has meant that patient pathways have had to be altered, so they go to mainly Glasgow and Edinburgh for treatment. However, I'm glad to say that very recently the board managed to appoint 2 consultant radiotherapists, so we're hopeful that we're out of the woods as far as that's concerned, but nonetheless we need to make sure that the north of Scotland, in conjunction with the whole of the rest of NHS Scotland, has in place contingency plans to make sure that we can manage that kind of situation should it occur again. In terms of attracting consultants to jobs in Scotland, NHS Education for Scotland have something called the START initiative, which is looking at marketing NHS Scotland, if you like, better south of the border and more widely, so we are better placed to recruit to key positions and avoid shortages, some of which are more predictable than others. People retire, you usually know when they're going to retire. Maternity leave is a bit less predictable. There are some specialties which are more feminised, to use that word, than others, paediatrics being the obvious one. And then, of course, there's sickness, which has already been mentioned as a complicating factor. But all boards are very conscious of the need to plan as cleverly as they can and to use NHS Scotland, Education Scotland, to help with recruitment processes.
Okay. I suppose just finally, are there any particular, are the problems of the recruitment the same Scotland-wide then, and the same types of consultant that's required, or are there variances around the country?
Well, I guess Scotland's geography means that we've got more remote and rural communities which require not just secondary care but primary care. And we have got areas of the country where it's been difficult to recruit general practitioners. Again, there are some specialties, emergency medicine, which would appear to be less attractive to trainees coming out. So again, we have to take that on board and make those posts as friendly as possible in terms of life-work balance. But again, Nez, whom I've mentioned, very conscious of the remote and rural issue and the need to attract people to posts there.
Okay. Dr. Keel, can I just follow up on this issue about recruitment of consultants? Is there a professional issue about the volume of patients or cases which a consultant sees that's regarded as necessary in order to maintain professional standards of expertise?
Thank you, Convener. That's a tricky area. Until fairly recently, there was not a strong evidence base between the volume of cases that a consultant was dealing with and their outcomes. But there is beginning to be emerging evidence in certain specialties. Highly specialised surgical techniques are an obvious one, where the volume of surgery carried out, or the greater the volume, seems to be associated with improved patient outcomes. I can think of areas such as esophagogastric surgery for cancer, highly specialised area. There's evidence around management of major trauma, for example, that the bigger centres, and this has been demonstrated for decades in the United States of America, bigger centres have better outcomes. And of course, we're beginning to move to a more structured system around management of major trauma in Scotland, so that all of the A&E departments will not be seeing major trauma cases going forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. Does that then mean that in order to make sure that patients have access to the top quality expertise, it sometimes is better concentrating resources and facilities than having them spread evenly across many centres in Scotland?
It might do. I think we're a bit of a way from being able to say that definitively. But another area I'm particularly interested in is cancer. I chair the Scottish Cancer Task Force. We need better data, and we're beginning to gather it in the area of cancer through the development of what we're calling quality performance indicators for each individual tumour, so lung, breast, etc., etc. And these are maybe 10 or 12 indicators that the clinicians think are of absolute prime importance to be able to measure in order to improve patient outcomes. And in some of them, but not all, there's an indicator around volume that clinicians should be seeing. Now, we're just beginning to gather that data. been gathering over the past year. But this year we'll begin to collate it at national level and take a look at it. I think based on that kind of data, we'll be able to, as we go forward, make more evidence-based statements around who should be doing what and where the volume of patients should be concentrated.
So is it the case that all patients admitted to accident and emergency will receive the same quality of care irrespective of which accident and emergency unit it is? Or are there circumstances where a medical decision will be taken that actually the person is better taken straight away to a centre where there is an identified expertise that could provide better patient outcomes?
Well, both actually. I mean, the roadside triage by our paramedic ambulance service is going to be crucial in a lot of these cases in determining what centre they should go to, whether they should go to their local A&E or whether that should be bypassed and they should go to one of the trauma centres. Equally, if a patient comes into a local A&E and it's clear that they are a major trauma case and that they would be better transferred to one of the 4 major trauma centres, then that should happen. So it's about patient triage.
Yeah. So there will be some consideration at some point in the future about whether the current levels of patient service and care can be adequately provided in our accident and emergency service, and at some point there will be some consideration about how best the patient is treated and where that expertise lies.
Well, for major trauma patients, that work is underway.
Right.
But not for the majority of cases that currently present to A&E. That's not what we're dealing with here.
No. And does the sustaining of the current levels of A&E right across Scotland then put any pressures on the rest of the health service?
Well, increasingly, emergency medicine has already been mentioned as a kind of pinch point because increasing numbers of patients are choosing to access the NHS via that route. And we've got a whole raft of work going on around unscheduled care to try and prevent patients who would be better going, being dealt with by another bit of the NHS, prevent them from getting to A&E, and equally making sure, and this comes back to the 4-hour waits, that patient flows through the whole hospital system are smoothed out so that beds become vacant for patients that need to be admitted. So lots of work going on in that as well.
And the recommendations of the care report, are they now redundant?
Well, Convener, that's going back a bit, but I don't think there were many recommendations in that report, but I think some of them have been implemented.
Yeah, but not all. And those that haven't been are now effectively redundant.
Well, you'd have to specify.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into a full debate in the care report, but we'll leave that sticking to the wall for the moment. Okay, listen, thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
No, just a little point of clarification. It would be in order to ask Mr. Gray, thank you for the answers earlier, but just on the issue of further information or further guidance from the Health Secretary on the use of confidentiality agreements, it was just to confirm that my own recollection that he did write to all boards last February suggesting that boards don't use them as a matter of course, and then he followed it up at a whistleblowing conference in the summer, I think, last year, saying that he did approve of whistleblowing. But so I just welcome, first of all, clarification of what it is. If you just write back to the committee on what it is, what decision you're expecting from the Health Secretary, but perhaps more importantly, whether or not you're able to provide the information I was highlighting earlier about whether or not all the compromise agreements, the 697 between 2007 and 13, did include guiding clauses, and perhaps more importantly or pertinently, whether or not since then the compromise agreements that have been signed include confidentiality clauses.
Okay, leave that with you, Mr. Gray. Thank you very much for your time. It was a very full session, informative, and it's given us something to reflect on. Thank you very much. And with that, we will now go into private session.